Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. The boot print halted mid-stride, simply halted, as if the wearer had simply been pulled from existence itself. I've lived the majority of the past 12 years of my life as a park ranger in Colorado's San Juan Mountains, spent mostly in the Ouray and Silverton area, where the crests reach above 14,000 feet and the thin air will spin your head like it's on an invisible teacup. I've witnessed a lot of weird things during my time here. Hikers claiming the trail switched on them overnight. Compasses spinning like they were possessed by an evil spirit. Sounds that came from the wrong direction. But what happened back in September 2019 is something I still lie awake worrying about. Something I never will be able to logically explain. It began on a Tuesday morning with a report from a hiker named Miles Vega, who failed to return from a 2-day solo trek on the Engineer Pass Trail. His girlfriend made the call at about 9 a.m. Miles hadn't showed the night before, as expected, and he wasn't taking his calls, just standard procedure in case of a missing hiker. These kinds of reports come in on us more often than you'd think, and in most instances, the lost hiker turns up a few hours later with their phone dead and their dignity bruised. But this particular case felt different from the very beginning. It could be because the weather report said there would be a cold front moving in by evening. Then again, it could simply be gut. Either way, I latched up my gear and headed out an hour later. My supervisor paired me with another ranger, a guy named Caleb who'd transferred in from Yellowstone about 6 months prior. He was competent, methodical, the kind of person you want beside you when things go sideways. We loaded up the truck with emergency supplies, radios, medical gear, the works, and drove up the winding mountain road toward the Engineer Pass trailhead. The drive alone takes about 45 minutes from the station, switchbacks carved into granite cliffs with drops that'll make your stomach flip if you look too long. When we arrived at the trailhead parking lot, Miles's truck was still there. A blue Ford Ranger, covered in a thin layer of morning dew. That wasn't necessarily a bad sign, not yet anyway, but it meant he was definitely still out there somewhere. We checked in with dispatch, confirmed our coordinates, and started up the trail. The morning was clear, almost painfully bright with that high-altitude sun that burns right through your skin. The aspens were starting to turn, flashes of gold and orange against the dark green of the spruce and fir. Beautiful country, the kind that makes you understand why people risk everything to be out here. The Engineer Pass Trail isn't particularly difficult by San Juan standards, but it's long, about 8 miles one way with an elevation gain that'll test your lungs if you're not acclimated. Miles's girlfriend had given us his planned route. He was going to hike up to the pass, camp near one of the alpine lakes, then loop back the next day. Simple enough. We figured we'd find him somewhere along that route, maybe with a twisted ankle or dealing with altitude sickness. We made good time for the first couple hours, calling out his name every few hundred yards, listening for a response that never came. The trail wound through dense forest at first, then opened up into meadows where the wildflowers had already died back for the season, leaving behind dried stalks that rattled in the wind. Above us, the peaks stood like broken teeth against the sky, their upper slopes already dusted with early snow that caught the sunlight and threw it back in blinding white sheets. Around noon, we stopped for a quick break near a creek crossing. Caleb pulled out his GPS unit, confirmed we were making decent progress. He said we should reach the area where Miles planned to camp within another hour or so. I remember looking up at the sky then, noticing how clouds were starting to build over the western peaks. Dark clouds, the kind that mean business up here. The temperature had dropped too, enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. We pushed on, moving faster now, both of us feeling the pressure of that incoming weather. The trail climbed steeply through a boulder field, forcing us to scramble over house-sized chunks of granite that had tumbled down from the peaks above sometime in the distant past. It was tough going, and I kept scanning the rocks for any sign of Miles, half expecting to find him wedged between two boulders with a broken leg. But there was nothing. Just rock and sky and the thin air that made every breath feel insufficient. Then we reached the lake. It was one of those high alpine tarns, perfectly round and so clear you could see every rock on the bottom, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. The kind of place that looks like it belongs on a postcard. And there, on the eastern shore, we found his camp. The tent was still standing, a small two-person backpacking tent in faded green nylon. The fly was properly staked out, the guy lines tight. Everything looked normal from a distance, but as we got closer I felt something in my gut start to twist. The campfire ring had been used recently. I could see fresh ash, and when I knelt down and held my hand over it I could still feel warmth. Not hot, but definitely warm. Which meant Miles had been here recently, maybe even that morning. But where the hell was he? Caleb called out again, his voice echoing off the granite walls that surrounded the lake. No response. Just that echo, bouncing back at us from what felt like the wrong direction. I've noticed that before up here, how sound behaves strangely in these high basins. But this was different. It almost sounded like his voice was coming from above us, from somewhere up on the ridge. We approached the tent carefully. I don't know why we were being cautious, maybe just instinct, but something felt wrong about the whole scene. I unzipped the tent fly and looked inside. Miles's sleeping bag was there, still spread out like he'd just gotten up from it. His backpack sat in the corner, along with the camp stove, some food bags hanging from a bear line, a book, a headlamp. All his gear exactly where it should be. But no Miles. I backed out of the tent and looked around the campsite more carefully. That's when I saw the boot prints. They led away from the tent, heading toward the trail that continued up toward the pass. Fresh prints in the soft dirt, the tread pattern clear and deep. I followed them with my eyes, watching as they led away from camp in a straight line. And then, about 30 yards out, they just stopped. I walked over to the last print, Caleb right behind me. We both stood there, staring down at it. It was a left boot, the impression clear and complete. The heel dug in slightly deeper than the toe, like he'd been walking with purpose. But there was no right boot following it, no prints continuing beyond it, nothing disturbed in the dirt or grass around it. It was like he'd taken one step and then simply ceased to exist. "What the hell?" Caleb said, his voice quiet. I didn't have an answer. I got down on my hands and knees, examining the ground around that last print. The dirt was undisturbed. No scuff marks, no drag marks, nothing to suggest he'd turned around or jumped or done anything except take one step and vanish. I looked up, half expecting to see a tree branch overhead that he might have grabbed onto, but there was nothing. Just open space and that cold mountain air. We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, moving in expanding circles from that last boot print. We checked behind every rock, every tree, called his name until our throats were raw. Nothing. It was like the mountain had swallowed him whole. The clouds were moving in fast now, rolling down from the peaks like a gray avalanche. Fog started to fill the basin, thick and cold, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. We needed to make a decision. The temperature was dropping fast, and we could see our breath coming out in thick plumes. Caleb radioed dispatch, explained what we'd found. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, barely audible through the static. She told us to mark the location, secure the campsite, and get back down before the weather turned completely. But I didn't want to leave. Every instinct I had as a ranger screamed that you don't abandon someone in the mountains, not when they could be hurt, not when they could be close. I told Caleb I wanted to push up toward the pass, check the trail above camp, but he grabbed my arm and pointed at the sky. The clouds weren't just rolling in anymore. They were dropping fast, a ceiling of gray that promised zero visibility within minutes. "We'll be back tomorrow with a full search team," he said. "Right now, we need to get off this mountain." He was right, but it killed me to turn around. We took photos of everything. The campsite, the boot prints, that final impossible print in the dirt. We secured Miles's tent, marked the location with GPS coordinates, and started back down the trail as the first fat snowflakes began to fall. The descent was a nightmare. The fog was so thick we could barely see 10 feet ahead. Our headlamps just bounced the light back at us, making it worse. We had to move slow, testing each step, following the trail by feel as much as sight. And the whole time, I kept thinking about Miles. Was he out there in this? Was he injured, hypothermic, waiting for help that wasn't coming? Halfway down, something happened that I still can't explain. We heard voices. At first, I thought it was other hikers, maybe people who'd gotten caught in the storm. The voices were distant, muffled by fog, but they sounded like they were having a conversation. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of speech, 2 or maybe 3 people talking. Caleb heard it too. We both stopped, straining to listen, trying to figure out which direction it was coming from. But the voices seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. They'd sound like they were ahead of us, then behind, then off to the side. We tried calling out, asking if anyone needed help, but the voices just continued, never acknowledging us, never getting closer or farther away. After about 5 minutes, they just stopped, just cut off mid-conversation, leaving us alone in the fog and silence. "Acoustic anomaly," Caleb said, but his voice shook slightly. "The mountains do that sometimes, sound bouncing around, echoing weird." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. I've heard echoes before. This was different. This sounded like actual people, close enough that we should have been able to find them. We kept moving, and thankfully the trail stayed where it was supposed to be. We made it back to the trailhead just as full darkness fell, both of us soaked from the snow and shaking from cold and adrenaline. We loaded into the truck, cranked the heat, and sat there for a minute, neither of us speaking. Then Caleb looked over at me. "That last boot print," he said. "You saw what I saw, right? It just ended?" "Yeah," I said. "I saw it." "How?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. We drove back to the station, filed our report, and went home to get a few hours of sleep before the full search operation kicked off at first light. But I didn't sleep. I kept seeing that boot print in my mind, that single left print just ending in the middle of nowhere. And I kept hearing those voices in the fog, having a conversation that we weren't meant to be part of. The next morning, we assembled a search team of 8 rangers, plus 2 volunteer search and rescue specialists, who knew the San Juans like the backs of their hands. The weather had cleared overnight, leaving everything coated in a thin layer of fresh snow that crunched under our boots. We drove back up to the trailhead in a convoy of 3 trucks, loaded down with gear, ropes, thermal imaging equipment, everything we might need. The hike back up to Miles's camp felt different in daylight. The fog was gone, replaced by crystalline air so clear you could see for miles. But that somehow made it worse, because now we could see just how vast this place was, how many ravines and cliffs and hidden valleys there were, how easy it would be for someone to disappear and never be found. When we reached the camp, everything was just as we'd left it. The tent, the warm fire ring, the boot prints leading away and then stopping. Our team leader, a veteran ranger named Sarah who'd been working these mountains for 20 years, examined the scene with the kind of methodical attention that comes from experience. She didn't say anything at first, just walked the perimeter, looked at the prints, checked the tent. Then she organized us into search lines, assigned sectors, and sent us out. I was paired with one of the SAR volunteers, a guy named Marcus who'd grown up in Telluride and had been climbing these peaks since he was a kid. We took the northern sector, following the ridge line above the lake. The going was slow, technical in places, requiring us to use our hands as much as our feet. We called out Miles's name every few minutes, paused to listen, then kept going. Nothing. By noon, none of the teams had found anything. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of a struggle or fall. It was like Miles had walked out of his tent, taken 30 steps and been erased from existence. We regrouped at the camp for a quick lunch, and I could see the frustration on everyone's faces. Sarah was on the radio with dispatch, requesting additional resources, maybe a helicopter for aerial search if the weather held. That's when I noticed something odd. The trail that continued past Miles's camp, the one leading up toward Engineer Pass, had fresh snow on it from last night's storm. And in that snow, I could see tracks. Animal tracks looked like elk or maybe deer, but there was something else too, something that made my skin prickle. Alongside the animal tracks were what looked like human footprints, but they were strange. Too evenly spaced, too perfectly aligned, like whoever made them was walking with an unnatural gait. I called Sarah over, showed her the tracks. She knelt down, examined them closely. Her face went pale. "These are fresh," she said quietly. "Made this morning, after the snow stopped." "Could it be Miles?" I asked. She shook her head. "Look at the pattern. These are too perfect. And they're heading up toward the pass. Why would Miles be heading up if he's lost or injured? He'd head down toward help." We decided to follow the tracks anyway. Maybe it wasn't Miles, maybe it was another hiker who'd seen our search efforts and was heading up to help look. We followed them for about half a mile, watching as they wound up the trail in that same unsettling pattern. Perfect spacing, perfect stride. The trail got steeper, rockier, until we were basically scrambling up a boulder field. And then the tracks just stopped. Again, mid-stride, just like Miles's had. But this time, they stopped at the edge of a cliff. I'm talking about a serious drop, maybe 300 feet straight down to a rocky talus slope. I got down on my belly, crawled to the edge, looked over. Nothing. No body, no disturbed rocks, no sign that anyone had fallen. The tracks just led right up to the edge and ended. Marcus backed away from the cliff, his face white. "This is wrong," he said. "This is all wrong." Sarah radioed the other teams, called everyone back to base camp. When we were all assembled, she laid out what we'd found. The impossible boot prints, the tracks leading to the cliff, the complete absence of any other evidence. She said we needed to expand the search, bring in more resources, maybe get some technical climbers to check the cliff faces. But I could see it in her eyes, the doubt, the fear. She'd been doing this job for 2 decades, and I could tell she'd never seen anything like this before. We searched for 3 more days. We brought in dogs, helicopters, technical rescue teams. We covered every inch of that basin and the surrounding peaks. We found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a drop of blood, not a single additional footprint. Miles Vega had simply vanished, and whoever or whatever had made those tracks to the cliff had vanished with him. On the 4th day, we had to call it. The weather was turning again, and we couldn't keep putting resources and lives at risk for someone who, by all evidence, was no longer there. Miles's girlfriend came up to the trailhead on that last day. I had to tell her that we'd done everything we could, but we hadn't found him. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring up at the mountains with this hollow look in her eyes. "He's still up there," she said quietly. "I can feel it. He's still up there somewhere." I didn't know what to say to that, because part of me believed her. Part of me thought that Miles was still up there, just not in any place we could reach. Not anymore. The official report listed Miles Vega as a missing person, presumed dead due to environmental exposure. His case file joined dozens of others in the Park Service database, unsolved disappearances in America's wilderness areas. But for me, it didn't end there. It couldn't. I started having dreams about a week after we called off the search. Always the same dream. I'm back at that alpine lake, standing next to Miles's tent, and I can see him in the distance, walking up the trail toward the pass. I call out to him, but he doesn't turn around. He just keeps walking in that strange, too perfect stride. And then he reaches a point on the trail where the air shimmers like heat waves rising off summer asphalt, and he just steps through it and disappears. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering, and I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep. My girlfriend at the time noticed, asked me what was wrong, but how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you watched a man's footprints end in the middle of a trail? That you followed tracks to a cliff edge that went nowhere? I started doing research. I know that sounds crazy, like I was becoming one of those conspiracy theorists you see online, but I needed answers. I started digging through old Park Service records, looking for similar cases in the San Juans, and what I found made that cold feeling in my gut even worse. Miles wasn't the first. Not even close. In 1947, a sheep herder named John Martinez vanished near Cinnamon Pass, about 15 miles east of where Miles disappeared. His sheep were found scattered across an alpine meadow, but Martinez was gone. The search party found his last campsite, his gear still there, his fire still warm. No trace of the man himself. In 1963, 2 college students hiking the Continental Divide Trail near Stony Pass reported finding a campsite with a tent, sleeping bag, and supplies, but no person. They reported it to authorities, but by the time rangers arrived, the entire campsite had vanished. Not just the person, the whole camp. The students were written off as pranksters. In 1982, an experienced mountaineer named Sarah disappeared while attempting a winter ascent of Uncompahgre Peak. Her climbing partner said she was 20 feet ahead of him on the ridge when she just stepped forward and was gone. He said it looked like she walked through a doorway that wasn't there. The official report said she fell, but they never found a body. In 1995, a trail runner named James was doing a solo run on the Lake Como Trail. His GPS tracker showed him making good time, maintaining a steady pace. Then his tracker just stopped, frozen at a single point on the trail. When rangers investigated, they found his running pack at that exact spot, his water bottle half full, his car keys, his ID. But no James. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every disappearance happened above 12,000 feet. Every one involved someone who was alone or separated from their group. Every one left behind warm campsites or gear that suggested the person had been there moments before. And every one happened in September or early October, right as the seasons were changing. I showed my research to Caleb one night over beers at a bar in Ouray. He'd been quiet since the search for Miles, more withdrawn than usual. I spread out the case files on the sticky bar table and walked him through what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, his expression getting darker as I went on. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. There are places in these mountains where the rules are different. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head, ordered another beer. Finally, after his third drink, he told me about something that happened to him at Yellowstone before he transferred here. He'd been part of a search team looking for a missing hiker in the backcountry. They'd found the hiker's camp, but no hiker. Standard missing person case. But while they were searching, Caleb said he saw something. He'd wandered about 100 yards from the main search area, following what he thought were fresh boot prints. The prints led him to a small clearing, and in the middle of that clearing, the air was wrong. That's the only way he could describe it. The air looked wrong, felt wrong, like it was thicker there, denser. And when he looked at it from the corner of his eye, he swore he could see something on the other side of it. Not another place exactly, but a different version of the same place. Like looking through a dirty window into a room that was almost, but not quite, identical to the one you were standing in. He'd reached out to touch it, curious, but something stopped him. Some deep survival instinct that said if he put his hand through that wrongness, he wouldn't get it back. So he backed away, rejoined the search team, and never mentioned what he saw. The missing hiker was never found. You think that's what happened to Miles? I asked. He walked through some kind of, portal? Caleb shrugged. I think these mountains are older than we understand. I think there are places where the boundaries get thin, and I think people who aren't careful, people who are alone at the wrong time in the wrong place, sometimes they slip through. That's insane, I said, but my voice didn't carry much conviction. Is it? He leaned forward. You saw those boot prints. You saw where they ended. You got a better explanation? I didn't. That was the problem. I had facts, but no rational explanation for them. A man had walked out of his tent, taken 30 steps, and ceased to exist in our world. And based on the historical record, he was just the latest in a long line of people who'd done the same thing. We didn't talk about it again after that night. There wasn't much point. What were we going to do? File a report saying we thought the San Juan Mountains were full of doorways to other dimensions. We'd lose our jobs, probably get sent for psychiatric evaluation. But I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention to the weather patterns, the dates of disappearances, trying to find some kind of correlation. And I found one. Every disappearance happened within 3 days of a major pressure system change. That transition period when high pressure gives way to low, when storms are building but haven't hit yet. When the air itself feels electric and strange. I also noticed something about the locations. If you plotted them on a map, they formed a rough line running northwest to southeast along the Continental Divide. Not a perfectly straight line, but close enough to be noticeable. And every single disappearance happened near water. Alpine lakes, streams, springs, places where water emerged from underground or pooled on the surface. I started marking my own maps, noting these high-risk areas. I didn't tell anyone else about it, but I paid attention. When I was out on patrol, I'd steer hikers away from certain areas if the weather was changing. I'd suggest alternate routes, claim there were rockfall dangers or bear activity. Most people didn't question it. They trusted the ranger's judgment. And for about a year, it worked. No more disappearances on my watch. I started to think maybe I'd figured it out. Maybe I could prevent whatever was happening just by being vigilant. Then, October of 2020 came around. I was up near Blue Lakes doing a routine patrol before we closed the upper trails for winter. It was late afternoon, that golden hour when the sun hangs low and turns everything amber and red. Beautiful day, clear sky, temperature just starting to drop as evening approached. I was alone, which wasn't unusual. Solo patrols are standard in the off-season when visitor traffic is light. I was following the trail around the upper lake when I felt it. That same sensation Caleb had described. The air went thick, heavy, like I was breathing through wet wool. And there was a pressure in my ears, like I'd climbed 1,000 feet in a matter of seconds. I stopped walking, my hand instinctively going to the radio on my belt. And that's when I saw her. A woman, maybe in her 30s, standing about 50 yards up the trail. She was wearing hiking gear, had a backpack on. Looked like any other backcountry hiker. But something was off. She wasn't moving, just standing there facing away from me, perfectly still. Too still, like a statue. I called out to her, asked if she was okay. She didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I started walking toward her, my boots crunching on the rocky trail, and I called out again. Still nothing. I got within 20 feet of her when I noticed the ground around her boots. It was disturbed, like she'd been standing there so long that the dirt had settled differently around her feet. And there was frost on her shoulders, actual frost, even though the temperature was still above freezing. "Ma'am," I said, louder this time. "Are you all right?" She turned around. I'm going to remember her face for the rest of my life. She looked normal at first glance, but her eyes were wrong. They were looking at me, but also through me, like she was seeing something else entirely, and her expression was blank, completely neutral. No fear or confusion or recognition. Just blank. She opened her mouth like she was going to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. And then she did something that made my blood run cold. She pointed behind me. I turned around, already knowing I shouldn't. Every instinct is screaming not to look. But I did anyway. And there, about 10 feet behind where I'd been standing, the air was shimmering. Just like in my dreams. Heat waves that shouldn't exist in 50-degree weather, rippling the landscape behind them like I was looking through water. When I turned back, the woman was gone. I'm talking instant, between one heartbeat and the next. 1 second she was there, solid and real. The next, nothing. Just empty trail and the sound of wind through the rocks. I backed away from that shimmer in the air, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't run. Something told me running would be a mistake, but I got out of there as fast as I could while still maintaining control. I practically flew down that trail, and I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my truck was parked. I sat in that truck for 20 minutes, shaking, trying to process what I'd seen. Then I radioed dispatch, reported a possible distressed hiker at Blue Lakes. I didn't mention the shimmer or how she'd vanished. I just said I'd encountered someone who seemed disoriented and needed assistance. They sent a team up. They searched the entire area. They found nothing. No footprints except mine. No sign anyone else had been there. That night, I typed up my official report, keeping it vague. Possible hiker sighting, unable to locate upon follow-up search. But I also started a personal file. A document I kept on my laptop that I never showed anyone. I described everything. The shimmer in the air, the woman's blank expression, the frost on her shoulders, the way she'd pointed behind me like she was trying to warn me. And I made a decision. I was done pretending this was normal. I was done writing off the impossible as coincidence or misperception. The San Juan Mountains were taking people. I didn't know why, didn't know how, didn't know if it was natural or supernatural or something in between. But it was real, and it was happening, and someone needed to do something about it. I started carrying extra gear on my patrols, chalk, the kind rock climbers use. I'd mark the trail behind me as I went, leaving a trail I could follow back if the trail itself decided to move. I brought a satellite phone in addition to my radio, made sure it was always charged. I carried flares, a whistle, everything I could think of that might help if I found myself in a situation like Miles had. And I stopped going alone to the high-risk areas. I always found an excuse to bring someone with me, another ranger or a volunteer. I figured whatever was happening, it seemed to target people who were alone. Maybe having a witness, having someone else present would be enough to keep that door from opening. For 6 months it worked. Winter came and went. Spring brought the snowmelt and the early season hikers. Summer was busy, tourist season in full swing. I kept my head down, did my job, kept people safe. No more disappearances, no more shimmers in the air. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe whatever window had been open had closed. Maybe the mountains had had their fill. Then, September rolled around again. The call came in on a Wednesday evening, just as I was finishing up my shift. A hiker had failed to check in at the end of the day, a solo backpacker named David, who'd registered for a 3-day trip in the Chicago Basin. He was experienced, had all the right gear, knew the area well, but his emergency contact hadn't heard from him when he was supposed to call, and they were worried. I felt that familiar cold dread settle in my stomach. Chicago Basin. September. Weather system moving in. All the markers were there. I volunteered to lead the search, and my supervisor agreed. We assembled a small team, just 4 of us, and headed out at first light the next morning. The approach to Chicago Basin is brutal, a steep climb that gains over 3,000 feet in less than 6 miles. We made good time despite the elevation, our legs burning as we pushed up the endless switchbacks. We reached the basin by mid-morning. It's a spectacular place, a massive cirque surrounded by 3 14ers, with a crystal-clear creek running through the middle and scattered alpine tarns reflecting the peaks like mirrors. On any other day, I would have stopped to appreciate it. But not that day. We found David's camp quickly. It was set up in a small grove of twisted pines near one of the larger tarns, his tent properly secured, his bear canister hung correctly, everything by the book. And just like with Miles Vega, the fire ring was still warm. "He was here this morning," Caleb said. He'd insisted on coming along, said he wouldn't let me do this alone. "Maybe a couple hours ago." We searched the immediate area, calling David's name, checking behind rocks and trees. Nothing. Then I found the prints. They led away from camp, heading toward the talus slope below one of the peaks. Boot prints, fresh and clear in the soft ground near the creek. I followed them with my eyes, watching them march in a straight line across the open basin floor. And then, about 100 yards out, they disappeared. Not ended. Disappeared, like the ground itself had swallowed them. I walked over to where the prints stopped, the rest of my team following. The last print was a right boot, the tread pattern perfectly preserved. And beyond it, nothing. The ground was undisturbed, no signs of anything unusual. The prints just ceased to exist at that point. "Again," Caleb whispered. "It's happening again." I knelt down, examining the ground more closely. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The dirt around that last boot print was darker than the surrounding soil, almost like it was wet. But when I touched it, it was completely dry. And it was warm, noticeably warmer than the ground around it. I stood up, looking around the basin. The sky was clear, perfect autumn blue, but I could feel the pressure changing. My ears were starting to pop, and there was that thickness in the air, that sensation of breathing through something denser than normal atmosphere. "We need to search the area," our team leader, a ranger named Tom, said. "Fan out, standard grid pattern. He's got to be here somewhere." But I wasn't listening. I was watching the air about 10 feet beyond that last boot print. It was starting to shimmer, the same heat wave effect I'd seen at Blue Lakes. Except this time, it was growing, spreading, like a curtain being slowly drawn open. "Stop," I said, my voice coming out harder than I intended. "Everyone stop moving." They all turned to look at me. Tom asked what was wrong, but I just pointed at the shimmer. They all saw it now, all of them staring at this impossible ripple in the air that was growing larger by the second. And then we heard it. A voice, distant and muffled, like someone calling from very far away. It was saying something, the same word over and over, but I couldn't make it out. The shimmer continued to expand, and the voice got slightly louder, more desperate. "Help! Please help!" It was David. I knew it was David. He was on the other side of that shimmer, wherever the other side was, and he was calling for help. I don't remember making the decision. One second I was standing there with my team, the next I was moving toward that shimmer. Caleb grabbed my arm, tried to pull me back, but I shook him off. David was right there, just beyond that curtain of wrong air, and I was done watching people disappear into it. I reached the edge of the shimmer and stopped. Up close, it was even more disturbing. The ripples in the air were moving in patterns that hurt to look at, flowing in directions that didn't make sense. And through them I could see something, a landscape that was almost the Chicago Basin, but not quite. The peaks were in slightly different positions. The trees were wrong. The sky was a shade of blue that didn't exist in nature. And there was David, standing maybe 20 feet away on the other side, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, behind me, his face twisted in confusion and fear. He was calling for help, but he couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. He was there, but we were invisible to each other. I reached out my hand toward the shimmer, my fingers getting closer and closer to that boundary. I could feel it now, a pulling sensation like a current trying to draw me in. It would be so easy to just step through, to cross over and grab David and pull him back. So easy. Caleb's voice cut through the haze in my mind. "Don't. Please don't. You go through that. We'll lose you both." He was right. Some deep part of me knew he was right. But David was right there, so close, and he was terrified and alone in a version of the world that wasn't quite ours. I pulled my hand back, tears streaming down my face that I didn't remember starting, and as I watched, David turned and started walking away, moving deeper into that wrong version of the Chicago Basin. I called out to him, screamed his name, but he didn't react. He just kept walking, getting smaller and smaller, until he disappeared behind a boulder that wasn't quite in the right place. The shimmer started to shrink. The curtain was closing, the doorway, or portal, or whatever the hell it was, sealing itself shut. Within minutes, it was gone completely, leaving nothing but normal air and the sound of the creek and the wind in the pines. We stood there in silence for a long time. Nobody knew what to say. Tom was pale, his hands shaking as he keyed his radio to report back to dispatch. "But what do you report? How do you explain what we'd just seen?" I walked back to David's camp, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I sat down on a rock and put my head in my hands. We'd seen it. We'd actually seen where these people were going. They weren't dying, weren't falling into hidden crevasses or getting lost in unmapped caves. They were slipping through into someplace else, somewhere that existed alongside our world but separate from it. Caleb sat down next to me. "We should tell someone," he said quietly. "The Park Service, researchers. Someone needs to know about this." "Who would believe us?" I asked. "We barely believe it ourselves. We have 4 witnesses. 4 rangers all saw the same thing. That has to count for something." I wanted to believe him, but I knew how it would go. We'd file our reports, they'd get flagged for review, we'd probably get sent for psychological evaluations. At best, they'd transfer us to desk jobs far away from the mountains. At worst, we'd lose our jobs entirely, be written off as a group of rangers who'd gone crazy from altitude exposure or something. We searched the basin for the rest of that day and most of the next. We documented everything, took photos, measurements, soil samples from the area where the shimmer had appeared. We marked the exact location with GPS coordinates, but David himself remained missing, and we all knew we weren't going to find him. Not in our version of the world, anyway. The official report listed David as missing, presumed lost due to a fall or environmental exposure. None of us mentioned the shimmer, the other place we'd seen, or David calling for help from somewhere we couldn't reach. We just filed our reports, marked the cases unsolved, and tried to go back to normal. But nothing was normal after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking about all those people. Miles Vega, the woman at Blue Lakes, David. All the historical cases I'd researched. They were all still alive somewhere, trapped in a version of the world that was close to ours but fundamentally different. And nobody was coming to help them because nobody even knew they were there. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't keep patrolling those mountains knowing what I knew. Seeing those high-risk locations marked on my maps and not being able to warn people about the real danger. Not rockfall or bears or weather, but the thin places where reality itself broke down and people could slip through into somewhere else. I gave my notice in November of 2020, told my supervisor I was burned out, needed a change. He didn't question it, just processed my resignation and wished me luck. Caleb left a month after I did. He moved back to Yellowstone, said he couldn't handle the San Juans anymore either. I moved to Denver, got a job doing environmental consulting, something safe and boring that keeps me in the city where the boundaries are solid and the air doesn't shimmer. But I still think about it every day. Still wonder about those people trapped on the other side. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull out my laptop and look at satellite images of the San Juan Mountains. I mark the locations where I know the thin places are, where the doorways open when the conditions are right. I've documented over 30 of them now, scattered across the high country, waiting for the next person to walk through. I've thought about going public, posting my research online, warning people. But who would believe me? A former park ranger claiming the mountains are full of portals to alternate dimensions. I'd be labeled a conspiracy theorist at best, dangerously delusional at worst. So instead, I keep my files, I mark my maps, and I wait. Maybe someday someone with more credibility than me will see what I've seen. Maybe researchers will figure out what's causing it, whether it's some kind of natural phenomenon or something else entirely. Maybe they'll find a way to bring those people back. But until then, they're still out there. Miles and David and the woman at Blue Lakes and all the others. Still alive, still lost, still wandering through a version of the San Juan Mountains that exists just slightly to the left of reality. And the mountains keep breathing, keep drawing in new victims when the conditions align. The trails keep ending in impossible places. The boot prints keep stopping mid-stride. And rangers like me, the ones who've seen too much, we keep our mouths shut and our heads down and try to forget. But we can't forget. That's the thing nobody tells you about witnessing the impossible. Once you've seen behind the curtain, once you know that the world is stranger and more dangerous than anyone wants to admit, you can't unknow it. You carry it with you forever. I still have nightmares about that last moment at Chicago Basin, watching David walk away into that wrong version of the world. In the dreams, I always reach through the shimmer. I always step across that boundary to try and save him. And I always wake up before I find out what's on the other side. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some doors aren't meant to be walked through, even to save someone. Maybe the only thing worse than knowing those places exist is actually going there. But I think about it. God help me, I think about it all the time. Last week, I saw a news report about another missing hiker in the San Juans. A woman this time vanished near Ice Lake Basin. The report said search teams had found her camp, still warm, gear all present, but no sign of the hiker herself. They were calling it a tragic accident, assumed fall or animal attack. I knew better, I knew exactly what had happened to her. She'd found one of the thin places, or, more accurately, It had found her. And now she was somewhere else. Somewhere close, but impossibly far, walking through a version of those mountains that we'll never reach. I pulled out my maps that night, marked Ice Lake Basin with a new notation. Number 31. 31 confirmed locations where the boundaries break down. 31 places where people can slip through into whatever lies beyond. And I wondered, not for the first time, if it works both ways. If people from that other place ever slip through into ours, if somewhere in the San Juans there's a confused hiker who doesn't quite belong, who comes from a world that's almost like ours but not quite right, it's a disturbing thought. The idea that we might walk past these displaced people every day, never recognizing them for what they are. Never realizing they're calling for help from the wrong side of reality. I'll probably never know the truth. Probably never understand what causes those thin places or where they lead. I'm just a former park ranger who saw too much and couldn't handle it. I left the mountains behind, but the mountains didn't leave me. They're still there, still breathing, still waiting. The trails still end in fog. The boot prints still stop mid-stride. And somewhere in those high basins, in those moments when the pressure changes and the air grows thick, the curtain parts, and people walk through into the nowhere places. And the mountains keep their secrets, as they always have, as they always will. If you're planning to hike the San Juans, especially in September or early October, especially above 12,000 feet, especially near water, please be careful. Watch the weather. Don't go alone if you can help it. And if you ever feel the air grow thick, if you ever see it start to shimmer, turn around. Walk away. Don't try to investigate, don't try to be brave. Because some doors, once you walk through them, don't let you come back. I learned that lesson watching other people disappear. I hope you never have to learn it yourself. Lena screamed my name into the canyon, and 3 seconds later, I heard it come back from behind us. That's not how echoes work. Sound doesn't bounce backward. It doesn't reverse direction and return from the place you just came from. But that's exactly what happened on the north face of Mount Sneffels in October of 2018, and it was just the beginning of the strangest 48 hours of my career as a park ranger. My name is Rory, and I've been working the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado for almost 15 years. I've pulled hypothermic hikers off 14ers in whiteout conditions. I've treated broken bones on technical ridges where one wrong step means a 1,000-foot fall, and I've talked down panicked climbers who froze up on exposed faces and couldn't move. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at someone. I was wrong. It started when we got a call about 2 overdue backpackers, a married couple in their early 30s named Derek and Amanda Price. They'd registered for a 4-day loop through the Mount Sneffels wilderness, planning to summit the mountain and camp at a few alpine lakes along the way. They were supposed to check in with Amanda's sister on Wednesday evening. When Thursday morning came and went with no word, the sister called it in. Standard protocol. We get calls like this maybe once a month during peak season, and 90% of the time, the missing hikers show up a few hours later, having lost track of time or decided to extend their trip. But something about this one felt different from the moment I took the call. Maybe it was the weather report showing an early season storm moving in. Maybe it was just instinct. Either way, I grabbed my gear and headed for the trailhead. My supervisor assigned me a partner for the search, a ranger named Lena, who'd transferred to our district about 8 months earlier from Rocky Mountain National Park. She was competent, thorough, the kind of person who triple-checked everything and never cut corners. I liked working with her. She didn't waste time with small talk on the trail, just focused on the job. We met at the Yankee Boy Basin trailhead around 10 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for one vehicle, a silver Subaru Outback with Colorado plates and a dog as my co-pilot bumper sticker. We ran the plates, Derek and Amanda's car, so they were definitely still out there somewhere. The trail from Yankee Boy Basin up toward Mount Sneffels is stunning but brutal. It starts at around 10,000 feet and climbs almost 3,000 more over the course of about 4 miles, switchbacking up through Krumholtz Pine and then breaking above treeline into a boulder field that seems to go on forever. The views are incredible. 360 degrees of jagged peaks and deep valleys, but you earn every one of those views with burning lungs and aching legs. Lena and I made good time despite the elevation. We called out the Price's names every few hundred yards, our voices carrying across the rocky slopes and bouncing back to us from the cliffs above. Normal echoes, predictable and correct. Sound traveling away, hitting a hard surface, returning. Physics working exactly as it should. We reached Blue Lake's Basin by early afternoon. It's a series of 3 alpine tarns, stair-stepping down the mountainside, their water so clear and cold it hurts to look at. The Prices had listed this as their first night's camping location. We found their camp easily enough, set up on a flat spot near the upper lake with a perfect view of the peaks. And that's when things started feeling wrong. The tent was still there, properly staked, the rain fly secured. Their bear canister sat about 50 yards away, hung correctly from a tree limb. I could see their sleeping bags through the tent's mesh window, along with backpacks and what looked like a camp stove. Everything was there. Everything except Derek and Amanda. Lena approached the tent while I checked the surrounding area for signs of struggle or accident. The campfire ring had been used recently, I could tell from the arrangement of the rocks and the gray ash inside, but the ashes were cold, not even a hint of warmth. That struck me as odd. If they'd had a fire the night before, there should have been some residual heat, but this felt like a fire that had been out for days. "Rory," Lena called out, her voice tight. "You need to see this." I walked over to where she was standing by the tent entrance. She'd opened the fly and was looking inside with the expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or concern. "What is it?" I asked. She pointed inside. "Look at the sleeping bags." I looked, 2 sleeping bags side by side, both zipped up completely. And here's what made my skin prickle. They were arranged perfectly, like they'd been deliberately posed. The zippers were facing the same direction, the hoods pulled tight and cinched, the bags lying flat and smooth without a single wrinkle. Nobody sleeps like that. When you get out of a sleeping bag, it's a mess. It's crumpled, half inside out, the zipper partially open. These looked like display models in a camping store. "Maybe they're just neat freaks," I said, but I didn't believe it. Lena shook her head. "Look at the ground." I shifted my attention to the tent floor. It was completely clean. No dirt, no pine needles, nothing. Like it had been swept. But more than that, the footprints around the tent entrance were wrong. There were too many of them, all overlapping, pointing in different directions. It looked like someone had walked in and out of the tent dozens of times, pacing back and forth, unable to settle. We checked their backpacks. Everything was there. Food, water filtration system, first aid kit, extra clothing, maps, even their phones. Both phones were dead. Batteries completely drained, which wasn't unusual. But when Lena tried to turn on Amanda's phone, something strange happened. The screen flickered to life for just a second, long enough to show the lock screen, and the date was wrong. The phone said it was September 28th. Today was October 3rd. The phone thought it was 5 days in the past. "Battery issue," I said. "When they drain completely, sometimes the internal clock gets messed up." "Maybe," Lena said, but she didn't sound convinced. We continued searching the area, moving in expanding circles from the campsite. The ground around Blue Lakes is mostly rock and hardy alpine grass. Not great for tracking, but we found a few signs. Boot prints heading away from camp toward the upper lake. We followed them to the water's edge, where they stopped at a large flat boulder that extended out over the water like a natural pier. And that's where we found the first really disturbing thing. Carved into the surface of the boulder, fresh enough that the stone dust was still visible in the grooves, was a message. Wrong way, turn back, not real. The letters were crude, scratched with a rock or maybe a knife. The hand that made them clearly shaking or rushed. I ran my fingers over the carved words, feeling the sharp edges where stone had been gouged away. "What the hell does that mean?" Lena asked. I didn't have an answer. Not real? What wasn't real? The trail? The mountains? Or something else? We needed to keep searching, find Derek and Amanda before the weather turned. The sky was already darkening to the west, those high-altitude clouds that mean business rolling in over the peaks. We had maybe 3 or 4 hours of good daylight left. Lena pulled out her radio to update dispatch, and that's when we discovered our radios weren't working properly. She could transmit, I could hear her voice coming through my speaker, but when dispatch responded, the audio was garbled, full of static and strange interference that sounded almost like whispering. We tried switching channels, checking our batteries, everything. No luck. The radios worked between us, but not with anyone else. "We should head back," Lena said. "Report what we found. Come back with a full team tomorrow." She was right, standard protocol in a situation like this. But something stopped me from agreeing. Those sleeping bags, that message carved in stone, the cold ashes. Something bad had happened to Derek and Amanda, and every minute we delayed might matter. "1 more hour," I said. "We check the trail toward the summit, see if they headed that direction. If we don't find anything, we head back." Lena looked at the darkening sky, then at me. After a moment, she nodded. We followed the trail that led from Blue Lakes toward the summit of Mount Sneffels. The path here is treacherous even in good conditions, a narrow track that winds through massive boulder fields where the rocks are the size of houses. You have to scramble in places using your hands as much as your feet, and one wrong step could send you tumbling down into gaps between the boulders that go down God knows how deep. We'd been climbing for maybe 20 minutes when I heard it. A voice, distant and muffled, calling for help. It sounded like it was coming from above us, farther up the trail toward the summit. "You hear that?" I asked Lena. She nodded, already moving faster, scrambling over the rocks toward the source of the sound. We called out, identifying ourselves as park rangers, asking if someone needed assistance. The voice called back, clearer this time. It was a woman, and she was saying she was hurt, needed help, please hurry. We pushed harder, our lungs burning in the thin air, hands scraping on rough granite as we pulled ourselves up through the boulder field. The voice kept calling, always from just ahead, always saying the same things. Hurt. Help. Please hurry. But as we climbed, something started bothering me. The voice wasn't getting any closer. We were moving fast, covering ground, but the voice maintained the same distance, the same volume, like it was staying just out of reach. Then Lena stopped so suddenly I almost ran into her back. "Rory," she said quietly. "That's my voice." I stopped, listened. The woman calling for help shouted again, and I felt ice water pour down my spine. She was right. The voice wasn't just similar to Lena's, it was identical. Same pitch, same inflection, same slight rasp on the hard consonants. It was Lena's voice coming from up ahead, calling for help. But Lena was standing right next to me. We stood there frozen, listening to Lena's voice echo down from the rocks above, begging for someone to come help her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, It stopped. Complete silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the boulders. "What the fuck was that?" Lena whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. Acoustic anomaly, maybe. Sound carrying weird in the mountains, bouncing in strange ways. But even as I thought it, I knew it was bullshit. That wasn't an echo. That was Lena's voice, active and present, speaking words she hadn't said. Lena pulled out her compass, checked our direction. Then she frowned, tapped the compass face, checked it again. "This can't be right," she said. I looked over her shoulder. The needle was spinning slowly, rotating in a complete circle every few seconds. Not just wandering like it does near metal deposits, spinning continuously like it couldn't find magnetic north. I pulled out my own compass. Same thing. The needle turned in lazy circles, unable to settle on any direction. "Magnetic anomaly," I said. "There's probably a lot of iron in these rocks." But I'd been working these mountains for 15 years, and I'd used my compass on this exact trail dozens of times. It had never done this before. The sky was getting darker fast now, those storm clouds rolling in ahead of schedule. We needed to make a decision, push forward into deteriorating conditions with malfunctioning equipment, or retreat and come back with backup. Lena made the decision for us. "We're going back. This is too many things going wrong. We report everything, come back tomorrow with a full team and better gear." I wanted to argue, but she was right. We were violating multiple safety protocols already, and the situation was degrading fast. We started back down through the boulder field, retracing our route toward Blue Lakes. That's when I realized the rocks were different. I'm not talking about subtle differences. I'm talking about the entire landscape had changed. The house-sized boulder we'd scrambled over on the way up, the one with the distinctive white quartz vein running through it, was gone. In its place was a different boulder, smooth and dark. The narrow gap we'd squeezed through had widened to a comfortable passage. The precarious balance of rocks that had required careful navigation had shifted. Some vanished entirely, others appearing where there had been clear trail before. "Lena," I said carefully, "are we on the right trail?" She was already looking around, her face pale. This doesn't look right, but we didn't turn anywhere. We came straight back down." We kept descending, both of us moving faster now, anxiety building with every step. The boulder field seemed to go on longer than it had before. The spaces between rocks deeper and darker. And the light was failing fast, that premature twilight that comes with thick cloud cover at high elevation. When we finally emerged from the boulders back into the alpine basin, I stopped dead. Blue Lakes was gone. I don't mean we couldn't see it, I mean the entire basin was empty. Where there should have been 3 crystal-clear tarns, there was nothing but rocky ground and patches of alpine grass. No water, no wetland vegetation, nothing to indicate there had ever been lakes here at all. "This is wrong," Lena said, her voice shaking. "This is impossible. We were just here an hour ago. Lakes don't just disappear." I pulled out my map, tried to orient myself. According to the topographic lines, we should be standing right next to the upper Blue Lake. The elevation matched, the surrounding peaks matched. We were in the right place, but the lakes were gone. Lena started to say something, then stopped, tilting her head like she was listening. I heard it too, a voice calling from somewhere in the basin. "Hello? Is someone there? We need help." A man's voice this time, coming from maybe 100 yards away. We moved toward it, calling out that we were park rangers. As we got closer, I could make out 2 figures in the dimming light, standing near where the shoreline of the upper lake should have been. It was Derek and Amanda. Had to be. 2 people, right age range, wearing backpacking gear. "Thank God," Amanda said as we approached. "We've been lost for hours. Our compass stopped working and the trail just... It's not where it's supposed to be. I should have felt relief. We'd found them, they were alive and mobile, the search was successful. But something was wrong with them. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Derek was talking now, telling us how they'd left their camp this morning to summit Sneffels, but the trail had changed. Nothing looked right. They'd tried to navigate back to their tent but couldn't find it, this morning. He said, this morning. "What day do you think it is?" I asked. They looked at each other. "Thursday," Amanda said. "October 3rd. We were supposed to check in with my sister yesterday, but our phones are dead." Today was Thursday, October 3rd. They thought it was the same day. They didn't realize they'd been missing for nearly 24 hours. And they were talking about leaving their camp this morning, but their tent was set up like a museum display. Their fire ring cold for days. "Where's your camp?" Lena asked. "Can you take us there?" Derek pointed off to the east, toward a section of the basin that was just empty rock. "Right over there by the lake." "What lake?" I asked quietly. He looked at me like I was crazy. "That lake. Right there. The upper Blue Lake." He was pointing at nothing, at bare ground. But the way he gestured, the way his eyes tracked across the space, he was seeing something we weren't. Lena grabbed my arm, pulled me a few steps away. "They're disoriented," she whispered. "Altitude sickness, maybe, or hypothermia. We need to get them down." But I was watching Derek and Amanda, watching the way they moved, the way they interacted with the space around them. Derek knelt down, cupped his hands like he was dipping them in water, then brought them to his mouth like he was drinking. But there was no water there. His hands were empty. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Right now. Something is very wrong here." We started trying to lead Derek and Amanda back toward the main trail, but they kept insisting their camp was right where they were standing, kept trying to go back to empty ground and describe their tent, their gear, everything they could see that we couldn't. That's when Lena screamed. She was staring past us, back toward the boulder field we'd descended from, and her face had gone bone white. I turned to look. A figure was standing at the edge of the boulder field, maybe 50 yards away. Too far to make out details in the failing light, but clearly a person. Standing perfectly still, just watching us. "Hello," I called out. "Do you need assistance?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the darker rocks. I started walking toward it, Lena following close behind. Derek and Amanda stayed where they were, still insisting their camp was right there, still seeing things that weren't present. As we got closer to the figure, I could make out more details. A woman wearing hiking clothes, a backpack. She was facing us, but something about her posture was wrong. Too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin. 20 yards away now, close enough to see her face in the dimness. She was pale, her expression blank, eyes open but not really focused on anything. Exactly like the woman I'd seen at Blue Lakes that time I'd been alone, the one who'd pointed behind me at the shimmer in the air before vanishing. "Ma'am?" Lena called out. "Are you all right?" The woman's mouth opened. For a moment I thought she was going to speak. But instead of words, I heard Lena scream. The exact scream she'd made 30 seconds ago, coming out of this stranger's mouth with perfect pitch and terror. Then the woman turned and walked into the boulder field, moving with that same rigid, too-perfect gait. We should have let her go. Every survival instinct I had was screaming to turn around, get Derek and Amanda, and get the hell off this mountain. But I couldn't help myself. I followed. The woman moved quickly despite her strange stride, weaving through the boulders like she knew the way perfectly. We struggled to keep up, scrambling over rocks in the near darkness. My headlamp bounced uselessly, creating more shadows than light. Then she stopped at a gap between two massive boulders, the kind of space that drops down into darkness deeper than any light can reach. She stood at the very edge, toes over the drop, and turned to look back at us. Her face had changed. It was still humanoid, still recognizably a face, but the features were slightly off. The eyes too far apart, the mouth positioned wrong, the entire geometry of it not quite right. Like someone had tried to recreate a human face from memory and gotten the proportions almost, but not entirely, correct. And then she stepped backward into the gap and disappeared. We scrambled to the edge, shined our lights down. Nothing but blackness, the beam swallowed by the depth. No sound of impact, no evidence she'd ever been there at all. "We're leaving," Lena said, her voice shaking. "Right now, this is beyond what we can handle." We turned back toward where we'd left Derek and Amanda, but the basin looked different again. The topography had shifted subtly, hills and depressions in slightly new positions, and Derek and Amanda were gone. We called their names, our voices echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The echoes came back wrong, arriving from multiple directions at once, overlapping and distorting until our own voices sounded alien to us. And then I heard it, my own voice coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "We're leaving, right now." The exact words I'd said 30 seconds ago, repeated back to me in my own voice, but I hadn't screamed them, hadn't shouted them into the distance to create an echo. I'd spoken them normally, conversationally. There was no way they should be echoing back now. Lena heard her own voice next, repeating something she'd said minutes earlier. Then my voice again. Then hers. A growing cacophony of our own words being played back to us from the darkness in random order, building on itself until it was like standing in a room full of recordings of ourselves. And underneath it all, Derek and Amanda's voices, calling for help, saying they were lost, asking if anyone could see them. "Cover your ears," I told Lena. "Don't listen to it." We moved as quickly as we dared in the darkness, trying to navigate back to the main trail by memory and feel more than sight. Our headlamps seemed to be working less effectively, the beams not penetrating as far as they should, absorbed by the air itself. The voices followed us, always just behind, always using our own words against us. I heard myself saying things I'd said hours ago at the trailhead, then things from days ago, conversations with other rangers. How long had this place been listening? How long had it been recording? We reached what should have been the main trail, but it wasn't there. Or rather, there were 3 trails, branching off in different directions, where before there had been only one clear path. Each looked equally legitimate. Each had signs of recent use. "Which way?" Lena asked. I pulled out my GPS unit. The screen was glitching, showing our position jumping around the map in impossible ways. One second we were at Blue Lakes, the next we were miles away near Yankee Boy Basin, then somewhere else entirely. The satellite signal was strong. The unit was functioning correctly, but the information it was providing made no sense. I closed my eyes, tried to remember the approach. We'd come from the west, following the sun. So if we headed toward the last light in the sky, we should be moving in the right direction. I opened my eyes, looked at the horizon. There were 3 sunsets. I'm not talking about reflections or light effects. I'm talking about 3 distinct positions in the sky where the sun appeared to be setting, each painting the clouds in shades of orange and red, each casting shadows in different directions. "Lena," I said carefully, "how many suns do you see?" She followed my gaze, and I heard her breath catch. 3. I see 3. "We're getting out of here," I said. Pick a trail, any trail, and we're running. We chose the middle path and started moving fast, jogging where the terrain allowed, scrambling where it didn't. Behind us, the voices had stopped, replaced by something worse. Footsteps. Multiple sets, keeping pace with us, never getting closer but never falling behind. The trail took us through terrain I didn't recognize. Rock formations that shouldn't exist in this area, vegetation types that didn't grow at this elevation. At one point, we passed a tree that was growing upside down, its roots in the air and its branches buried in the ground, leaves growing normally as if gravity had reversed just for this one organism. Lena grabbed my arm, pointed ahead. In the darkness, I could see lights, headlamps, maybe a dozen of them, moving in a line across the mountainside. Other hikers, or maybe a search team looking for Derek and Amanda, or looking for us. We called out to them, waved our own lights. The other lights stopped, turned toward us. Then they started moving in our direction, and as they got closer I realized something was wrong with the way they moved. They swayed and bobbed in a pattern that didn't match human walking. Too smooth, too rhythmic, hypnotic. Don't look directly at them, I said to Lena. Keep them in your peripheral vision. We kept moving, trying to angle away from the approaching lights without being obvious about it. But they adjusted their course, cutting us off, herding us toward a section of the mountain that dropped away into a deep ravine. That's when I remembered the flares in my pack. Emergency signal flares, the kind that burn bright red for 30 seconds. I pulled one out, struck it, and the mountainside lit up in hellish crimson light. The approaching lights stopped. In the flare's glow, I could see what was carrying them. Shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Too tall, too thin, limbs bent at joints that shouldn't exist. And instead of headlamps, the lights were coming from inside them, glowing through their skin like they were hollow shells filled with cold fire. They didn't like the flare. The things started backing away, their lights dimming. I lit a second flare, threw it toward them, and they scattered, disappearing into the rocks and shadows. "Run," Lena said. "While they're gone, run!" We ran, abandoning caution, leaping over obstacles we could barely see, trusting momentum and luck more than skill. The trail twisted and dropped, descended through switchbacks that seemed to go on forever. My lungs were screaming, muscles burning, but we didn't stop. And then, suddenly, we broke out of the darkness into normal twilight. Real twilight, the natural fading of a single sun. The air felt different, thinner but cleaner, without that thickness that had been pressing down on us. Behind us, the mountain looked exactly as it should, the familiar profile of Mount Sneffels against the darkening sky. We'd escaped whatever that place was. We'd gotten out. We kept running until we reached the parking lot at Yankee Boy Basin. Derek and Amanda's Subaru was still there, but now there were 2 other vehicles too. Park service trucks, and rangers were unloading gear, preparing for a night search. One of them saw us, shouted to the others. We were surrounded quickly, people asking questions, checking us for injuries, wanting to know what happened. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and process what we'd experienced. My supervisor, a ranger named Tom, pulled me aside. "You've been gone for 6 hours," he said. "We were about to send a full team up after you." 6 hours. It had felt like longer, like days had passed in that distorted space, but my watch confirmed it. 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. 6 hours. "Derek and Amanda Price," I managed to say. "We found them, but we lost them again. They were wrong. Everything up there is wrong." Tom's expression shifted from concern to something else. Fear, maybe. Recognition. "Come with me," he said quietly, leading me away from the others. He took me to his truck, unlocked a storage box in the bed, and pulled out a folder. Inside were reports, dozens of them dating back decades. Missing persons in the San Juan Mountains, all within a 10-mile radius of where we'd just been. Different rangers, different years, but the same patterns. Compasses spinning, echoes coming from wrong directions, landscapes changing, people seeing things that weren't there. This has been happening for a long time, Tom said. We don't talk about it. Can't talk about it officially, but rangers know. Some of these mountains have thin places where things get confused, where reality doesn't quite work right. Derek and Amanda, I started. They're gone, Tom interrupted. I'm sorry, but if they were in one of the thin places when you were, if they were seeing a different version of the landscape, they're not coming back. Not as themselves. I wanted to argue, to insist we mount a proper search, but I remembered how Derek and Amanda had been. Standing in empty space, describing a lake that wasn't there, drinking from water we couldn't see. They were already lost, already existing in some other version of the mountain that overlapped with ours but didn't fully coincide with it. Lena joined us, her face still pale. Tom showed her the folder, explained the same things he'd told me. We stood there in the parking lot as full darkness fell. 3 rangers sharing a secret that couldn't be officially acknowledged. What do we put in the report? Lena asked. The truth, mostly, Tom said. You found their camp, it was abandoned. You searched the surrounding area but didn't locate them before weather forced you to retreat. That's accurate. You just leave out the parts that sound crazy. We filed our reports exactly as he suggested. A full search team went up the next day, found Derek and Amanda's camp exactly as we'd described it. The sleeping bags arranged too perfectly, the cold fire, the message carved in rock. They searched for 3 days, found nothing, and the case was classified as missing, presumed dead due to environmental exposure. But I knew better. They weren't dead. They were just somewhere else, trapped in a version of the San Juans that didn't quite line up with ours, seeing lakes that didn't exist, hiking trails that led nowhere, calling for help that would never come. The nightmares started about a week later. Always the same dream. I'm back in that distorted basin, the one with 3 sunsets and upside-down trees, and I can hear Derek and Amanda calling my name. But when I try to find them, I realize I'm seeing my own footprints. I'm following my own trail in circles, and each time I complete a loop, the landscape has shifted slightly, become a little more wrong. I wake up in cold sweats, feeling like the walls of my bedroom aren't quite where they should be, like the angles are slightly off. Lena stopped coming to work 3 weeks after the incident. I heard she transferred to a park in Arizona, somewhere flat and desert, as far from mountains as she could get while staying in the park service. I don't blame her. I kept working the San Juans, but I was different. More cautious. More aware of the subtle signs that something was off. The way sound carried. The behavior of compasses and GPS units. The angle of shadows that didn't quite match the sun's position. And I started noticing things I'd missed before. How certain valleys always had slightly more fog than they should. How specific ridgelines seemed to shimmer in peripheral vision. How hikers would sometimes report feeling watched, or hearing voices when they were alone, or finding their own footprints where they hadn't walked. Tom was right. This had been happening for a long time. The mountains were full of thin places. Spots where the boundaries broke down and multiple versions of reality pressed against each other. Most of the time, people passed through these areas without incident. The boundaries were stable, the overlap minimal. But sometimes, when conditions aligned, atmospheric pressure changes, certain times of year, specific elevations, the boundaries became permeable. And people slipped through. Or things slipped through into our side. I started keeping my own records, documenting every anomaly I encountered or heard about. Strange echoes, compass failures, missing time, distorted landscapes. The pattern became clearer the more data I collected. The thin places were clustered in specific areas and they were more active during transitional seasons. Spring and fall, when the weather was unstable, when cold and warm air masses collided over the peaks. And they were getting worse, more frequent, more intense. Whether that was due to climate change affecting atmospheric conditions or some other factor I couldn't say. But the number of incidents was increasing. 6 months after Derek and Amanda disappeared, I had another encounter. I was doing a routine patrol near Crystal Lake, solo this time because we were short-staffed. It was early March, one of those perfect late winter days when the sky is impossibly blue and the snow reflects so much light it hurts to look at. I'd stopped for a break near the lake's outlet, was sitting on a rock eating a protein bar, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, crunching through the snow, coming from directly above me. I looked up. There was nothing above me but sky. I was sitting at the base of a cliff face, a sheer rock wall that went up about 80 feet. No ledges, no places for anyone to stand. But the footsteps continued, clearly audible, the crunch of boots and snow coming from somewhere overhead where nothing should exist. I stood up, moved away from the cliff, and the footsteps followed. They stayed directly above me, matching my pace, as if someone was walking on the other side of a ceiling I couldn't see. I started to run, and the footsteps ran too, keeping perfect time. Then they stopped. Complete silence. I stopped too, breathing hard, spinning in a circle to scan the area. Nothing, no one. Just me and the snow and the impossible footsteps that had been walking on air. A voice called out, distant but clear. "Rory, is that you?" I recognized the voice immediately. It was Derek. Derek Price, the hiker who'd vanished 6 months ago. "Derek," I called back, "where are you?" "I don't know," his voice replied, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "We've been trying to find our way back, but nothing's where it should be. The trails keep changing. We keep seeing people, but they can't see us. Can you see us?" I spun around, looking for any sign of movement. "No, I can't see you. Where are you?" "We're right here." Amanda's voice joined Derek's. "We're standing right in front of you. Why can't you see us?" They were in that other place, that overlapping version of the landscape. Close enough to communicate, to share the same space, but unable to actually interact. Separated by a boundary we couldn't cross. "The lakes," Derek's voice said. "We need to find the lakes, that's where it started. That's where we can get back." I thought about Blue Lake's basin, where we'd found their camp. Where the lakes had disappeared when we were in that distorted space. Maybe the water was important somehow, maybe it marked the boundaries. "Head toward water," I called out. "Find any stream or lake and stay near it. I'll try to help you." "We can't find the water," Amanda said, her voice breaking. "There isn't any water here, everything's dry. The lakes are gone, the streams are gone, it's all just rock and dust." I remembered how Derek had mimed drinking from the non-existent Upper Blue Lake, cupping empty hands to his mouth. They were seeing a version of the landscape without water, a desiccated mirror of the San Juans where the alpine lakes had never formed. "Listen to my voice," I said. "Use it to orient yourself. Head in my direction." "We're trying," Derek said. "But you keep moving. Every time we walk toward you, you're suddenly somewhere else. It's like the distance between us keeps changing." I stood perfectly still, kept talking, describing what I could see. The cliff, the lake, the snow-covered peaks. And I heard them getting closer, their voices growing louder until it sounded like they were standing right next to me. "I can almost see you," Amanda said. "There's like a shimmer in the air. I can see your outline through it." "Can you reach through?" I asked. Can you touch it? A pause, then Derek. I'm afraid. What if I put my hand through and it... What if it takes my hand? What if I get stuck halfway? I understood his fear. I felt it too, remembering how I'd almost reached through the shimmer when I'd seen it before. How something had stopped me. But this might be their only chance. You have to try, I said. I'll be right here. If you can reach through, I'll grab your hand and pull you back. Another long pause. I stared at the empty air in front of me, seeing nothing but trusting that they were there, separated by something thinner than paper, but stronger than steel. Then I felt it. The air in front of me grew thick, that familiar pressure building. And I saw it start to form, that heat wave shimmer, even though the temperature was below freezing. It grew larger, spreading like a crack in reality, and through it I could see something. A landscape that was almost the Crystal Lake Basin, but wrong, darker, drier, the peaks sharper and more hostile. And I could see Derek and Amanda standing on the other side of that boundary, looking at me with expressions of desperate hope. Derek extended his hand toward the shimmer. His fingers approached the boundary, got within inches of it. I reached out too, my hand trembling. Our fingers should have touched. We were close enough. But there was something between us, invisible but impenetrable. Derek's hand pressed against it. I could see the flesh compressing, but he couldn't push through. It was like there was a pane of glass between us, allowing us to see each other but not touch. I can't, Derek said, his voice thick with tears. I can't get through. I pushed harder from my side, trying to break through the barrier, but it was useless. We were too separate, too far apart, despite being inches away from each other. Don't give up, I said. I'll figure this out. I'll find a way to bring you back. But even as I said it, the shimmer was fading. The boundary between our worlds was closing, the momentary overlap ending. Derek and Amanda's faces grew distorted as the view through the shimmer degraded, and then they were gone. I was alone at Crystal Lake, standing in the snow with my hand extended toward nothing. That encounter changed everything for me. Derek and Amanda were alive, conscious, aware of their situation. They'd been trapped in that other place for 6 months, wandering through a version of the San Juans that didn't quite match ours, unable to find their way back. And they weren't alone. If the pattern held, there were others there too, all the missing hikers and climbers and backpackers who'd vanished in these mountains over the decades. I became obsessed with finding a solution. I read everything I could about parallel dimensions, quantum mechanics, folklore about thin places and liminal spaces. I interviewed old-timers, people who'd been working these mountains for 40 or 50 years, collecting their stories of strange encounters and unexplained phenomena. One old ranger, a man named Bill, who'd retired in the 90s, told me something useful. He said there were certain days when the boundaries were thinnest, days you could predict based on atmospheric conditions and lunar cycles. And on those days, if you were in the right place, you might be able to open the door wider, make the crossing easier. He gave me dates, showed me his calculations. I didn't fully understand the math, but I trusted his experience. He'd been studying this for longer than I'd been alive. The next optimal date was 3 weeks away. April 23rd, during a new moon, when a low-pressure system would be moving through the area. Bill said if I was going to try to bring someone back, that would be the best chance. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I gathered equipment, planned routes, studied maps. I told no one what I was doing, because officially, Derek and Amanda were dead. Missing, presumed fallen or exposure victims. If I admitted I'd been communicating with them, I'd be put on psychiatric leave at best. April 23rd came with perfect conditions. Low pressure, new moon, and a light fog rolling through the mountains. I headed to Blue Lakes Basin alone, arriving just before dawn. I'd calculated that the optimal time would be early morning, when day and night were balancing, when the light was changing. I stood at the spot where we'd found Derek and Amanda's camp, the place where this had all started. The lakes were there this time, exactly where they should be, their surfaces mirror still in the pre-dawn light. And I waited. As the sun rose, I felt it start to happen. The air thickened, pressure building in my ears. The light took on a strange quality, too bright and too dim at the same time. And the shimmer formed, larger than I'd ever seen it. A curtain of distorted reality hanging in the air like a waterfall. Through it, I could see that other place, the dried-up version of Blue Lakes Basin, the hostile landscape where Derek and Amanda were trapped. And I could see them, standing on the far side, waiting. "Now!" I shouted. "Try now!" Derek approached the boundary again, more confident this time. He pressed his hand against it, pushed hard, and this time something gave. The barrier flexed, thinned. His fingers started to come through, breaking into our reality like pushing through a membrane. I grabbed his hand, felt solid flesh under my fingers. He was real, tangible. I pulled as hard as I could while Derek pushed from his side. The boundary resisted, tried to snap back, but we fought against it. And then, with a sensation like popping through the surface of water, Derek fell through into our world. He collapsed on the rocky ground, gasping, his body shaking from the transition. But he was here. He was solid. He was back. Amanda came through next, easier now that the boundary had been breached once. She stumbled through and fell to her knees next to Derek, both of them crying, clutching at the ground like they couldn't believe it was real. I helped them both stand, supporting their weight as they adjusted to being fully present in our reality again. They were thin, exhausted, their gear worn and damaged, but they were alive. The shimmer started to close, the boundary resealing itself. Through it, I caught a glimpse of someone else on the other side. A man I didn't recognize, standing at the edge of the closing door, reaching toward us. But before I could react, the shimmer collapsed completely, the boundary snapping shut. I got Derek and Amanda down to the trailhead, radioed for medical assistance. The official story was that they'd been injured and disoriented, had spent the intervening months recovering in a remote part of the wilderness before finding their way back to the trails. Nobody questioned it too closely. Missing hikers showing up alive is rare, but not impossible. They didn't tell anyone the truth about where they'd been. How could they? Who would believe it? They said they'd gotten lost, hit their heads, had spotty memories of the missing time. The doctors attributed their confusion to trauma and dehydration. But Derek pulled me aside before they left the hospital. "There were others there," he said quietly. "People who've been missing for years. They need help too." I knew. I'd seen the man at the boundary, the one who hadn't made it through before the shimmer closed. And if Bill's calculations were right, there would be another optimal window in 6 months. I started planning immediately. Next time, I'd be more prepared. I'd bring more equipment, maybe even convince another ranger to help. We could bring back multiple people. Could start emptying that prison dimension that overlapped with our world. But the Park Service had other ideas. Word had gotten back to the administrators about my unauthorized solo patrol on April 23rd. My presence at a closed area without proper clearance. There was an investigation. Questions about whether I'd somehow been involved in Derek and Amanda's disappearance and reappearance. I was suspended pending the investigation's outcome. My access to park resources was revoked. I couldn't go back to Blue Lakes Basin even if I wanted to. The investigation cleared me eventually. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, just policy violations. But by then, I'd made a decision. I couldn't work for an organization that would rather ignore the truth than acknowledge it, that would rather classify people as dead than admit the mountains were full of thin places where reality broke down. I resigned from the Park Service in August 2019, moved to Grand Junction, got a job doing trail maintenance for the Bureau of Land Management. Safer work, flatter terrain, no thin places or dimensional boundaries to worry about. But I couldn't forget about the others, the people still trapped in that overlapping world, wandering through a distorted version of the San Juans, unable to find their way back. So I keep track of the dates. I monitor atmospheric conditions, lunar cycles, pressure systems. And when the conditions are right, I take personal time off work and drive back to the San Juans. Not to the official trails, not to the places where rangers patrol, but to the thin places, the spots where the boundaries are weakest. I don't always succeed. Sometimes the shimmer forms, but no one is close enough on the other side to cross through. Sometimes it doesn't form at all, the conditions not quite perfect despite my calculations. But sometimes, maybe 1 time out of 5, someone makes it through. I've brought back 7 people so far. Hikers who vanished in 2015, 2008, even one who went missing in '97. Each one dazed and disoriented, unable to fully explain where they'd been, but alive and solid and back in the right reality. The Park Service doesn't know what to make of these reappearances. They have theories, hidden caves where people survived, amnesia and wandering, hoaxes. They don't have the truth because the truth is impossible. But I know, and Derek and Amanda know, and the 7 people I've brought back know, even if they can't articulate it. The San Juan Mountains have thin places, spots where our world presses against another version of itself, and sometimes people slip through the gaps. Most who cross over are lost forever, wandering endlessly through that distorted landscape. But some find their way back to the boundaries, and if they're lucky, if the conditions are right, if someone is there to pull them through, they can come home. I'll keep doing this as long as I can. Keep monitoring the conditions. Keep driving back to the mountains on optimal dates. Keep standing at the boundaries and reaching through to pull people back. It's dangerous. Every time I get close to a shimmer, I risk falling through myself, becoming trapped on the other side. But I've seen too much to walk away now. I've heard my own echoes coming from the wrong direction. I've watched landscapes shift and change. I've looked through the boundary at a version of reality that doesn't quite match ours. And I've seen the people trapped there, calling for help, unable to find their way back. So I'll keep answering those calls. Keep standing at the edge of the thin places. Keep pulling people through when the boundaries allow it. Because someone has to. And because I know that any day, any patrol, any hike in the mountains could be the one where I take a wrong step, where the conditions align, where the boundary opens beneath my feet and I find myself on the other side, looking back at a world I can see but can't reach. It's only a matter of time. The mountains are patient. The thin places are always there, always waiting. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear echoes coming from the wrong direction. My own voice, speaking words I haven't said yet, warnings I haven't given. And I know that somewhere, in some version of the San Juans that exists alongside ours, there's another me who already slipped through, already found out what happens when you cross the boundary and can't come back, already learned what it's like to wander through a world that's almost right but fundamentally wrong. I just hope when that day comes for this version of me, when I finally step through and get trapped on the other side, someone will be there 6 months later when the conditions are right. Someone will stand at the boundary and reach through. Someone will pull me back. But if they don't, if I'm stuck there forever, at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I brought some people home before the mountains claimed me. That's more than most people get. And in the thin places where reality breaks down and echoes come from the wrong direction, sometimes that has to be enough. I marked the trail with bright orange tape every 50 yards, tying it carefully to branches and rocks at eye level. By the time the sun came up, every single piece of tape was still exactly where I'd placed it. But they were all pointing in the wrong direction. My name is Theo, and I've been a park ranger in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado for 8 years. I've guided lost hikers out of box canyons. I've treated altitude sickness at 13,000 feet, and I've rappelled down cliff faces to reach injured climbers. I thought I knew these mountains. I thought I understood how they worked, how to read them, how to stay safe in them. September of 2020 taught me I was wrong about all of that. It started when we got a report about a missing solo hiker named Marcus Hendricks. He was 53, experienced, had summited most of the 14ers in Colorado. He'd registered for a 5-day trek through the Weminuche Wilderness, planning to loop through some of the more remote basins north of Silverton. His wife called it in when he didn't arrive at the arranged pickup location on Tuesday morning. Standard search protocol. My supervisor assigned me a partner, a newer ranger named Vera, who'd transferred from Glacier National Park about 4 months earlier. She was sharp, methodical, the kind of person who checked her gear 3 times before leaving the station. We'd worked together on a few searches before, and I trusted her judgment. We drove up to the trailhead at Mullis Pass, where Marcus had started his trek. His truck was still in the parking lot, a green Toyota Tacoma with Montana plates and a bike rack. We checked in with dispatch, confirmed our route, and started up the trail around 9 a.m. The day was perfect for a search. Clear sky, mild temperature, good visibility. The aspens were just starting to turn, patches of gold appearing among the dark green of the spruce and fir. We made good time on the main trail, calling Marcus's name every few minutes, listening for a response that never came. According to his filed route plan, Marcus had intended to camp the first night near Little Mullis Lake, then push up toward the Continental Divide Trail for nights 2 and 3. We figured we'd find him somewhere along that route, maybe dealing with a sprained ankle or equipment failure. We reached Little Mullis Lake by early afternoon. It's a small alpine tarn, maybe a quarter mile across, surrounded by stands of twisted pine and open meadow. Beautiful spot, the kind of place that makes you understand why people risk so much to be out here. We found his campsite on the north shore. The tent was still standing, properly staked. The rain fly secured against weather that hadn't come. His bear canister was hung correctly about 70 yards from the tent. Everything looked normal, orderly, exactly how an experienced backpacker would set up camp. Except Marcus wasn't there. Vera checked inside the tent while I examined the surrounding area. His sleeping bag was there, still in its stuff sack. His backpack, his stove, his water filter, all his gear. His boots were lined up neatly outside the tent entrance, as if he'd taken them off before going inside. But there was no sign of Marcus himself. "Theo," Vera called out. "Look at this." I walked over to where she was standing by the tent. She was holding Marcus's journal, a small waterproof notebook that he'd apparently been using to document his trip. The last entry was dated Monday, the day before he was supposed to be picked up. The entry was strange. Just 3 words, written in increasingly shaky handwriting that degraded into illegible scrawls. Trail keeps moving. Nothing else. No explanation, no context. Just those 3 words and then frantic pen marks that didn't form letters. "What does that mean?" Vera asked. I didn't have an answer. Trails don't move. They're fixed routes, worn into the landscape by decades of foot traffic. but something had rattled Marcus badly enough to write those words, to press so hard with his pen that he'd torn through the page in places. We continued searching the area, moving in expanding circles from the campsite. We found boot prints leading away from the tent toward the trail that continued north toward the divide. Fresh prints, had to be Marcus's based on the size and tread pattern. We followed them for about 100 yards until they reached a fork in the trail. And that's where things got confusing. There should have been one trail at this location. I'd hiked this area dozens of times, knew the route by heart. The Continental Divide Trail continued north. No forks, no alternate routes for at least 3 miles. But there were 2 trails now, branching off in slightly different directions, both looking equally legitimate and well-traveled. I pulled out my map, a topographic chart I'd marked up over years of patrols. According to my map, there was only one trail here. I pulled out my GPS unit, checked the satellite overlay. Same thing, one trail heading north-northwest. But my eyes were telling me something different. 2 trails, both worn smooth by foot traffic, both marked with the same faded trail markers. "Which way did he go?" Vera asked. I examined the boot prints more carefully. They led to the fork and then stopped. Both trails showed tracks, Marcus's distinctive tread pattern visible in the soft dirt. It looked like he'd somehow walked both directions simultaneously. "That's impossible," Vera said, kneeling down to examine the prints herself. "He couldn't have gone both ways." She was right. It was impossible. But the evidence was there, clear as day. Marcus's boot prints led down both trails. We had to make a choice. I flipped a mental coin and chose the left fork, the one that angled more to the northwest. We marked the location with bright orange flagging tape, noting the coordinates, and started following the prints. The trail climbed steadily through dense forest, switchbacking up a steep slope. Marcus's prints were easy to follow, clear impressions in the dirt showing he'd been moving fast, taking long strides. After about 20 minutes, the trail emerged from the tree line into an open, alpine basin. I stopped so suddenly that Vera almost ran into me. The basin was wrong, completely wrong. According to my map, we should be approaching Elk Creek drainage, a long valley that ran north-south with a clear stream down the middle. But this wasn't Elk Creek. This was a circular basin, maybe half a mile across, surrounded by peaks I didn't recognize. The topography didn't match anything on my map. "Are we lost?" Vera asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I pulled out my GPS, checked our position. The screen showed us exactly where we should be. Elk Creek drainage, elevation 11,800 feet. But the landscape around us bore no resemblance to what the GPS claimed. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily in circles, unable to settle on magnetic north. "Equipment failure," I said, but I didn't believe it. My compass had never malfunctioned before, and the GPS was getting strong satellite signals. The units were working fine, they just weren't agreeing with reality. We continued following Marcus's prints across the basin. They led to a cluster of large boulders on the far side, and there we found something that made my stomach knot. A cairn, a carefully constructed stack of rocks, about 3 feet high, with a piece of orange flagging tape tied to the top. The same kind of tape we used for trail marking. And next to the cairn, scratched into the smooth surface of a boulder, was a message. "Second time here." Trail loops back going east instead. The words were carved deep, done with a rock or knife blade. The stone dust still fresh in the grooves. "He's been here before," Vera said quietly. "He followed this trail, ended up here, marked it, and then he came back here again," I finished, "even though he tried going a different direction." We looked at the prints leading away from the cairn. They headed east, exactly as Marcus's message indicated. We followed them for another 15 minutes until we reached a narrow gap between two rock walls, a natural gateway that funneled us through to the other side. When we emerged, we were back at Little Mullis Lake. I'm not talking about a lake that looked similar. I'm talking about the exact same lake, with Marcus's tent still standing on the north shore, his bare canister hanging from the same tree. We'd walked for almost an hour, climbed maybe 800 feet in elevation, crossed through unfamiliar terrain, and somehow ended up right back where we'd started. Vera was already checking her GPS, her face pale. This doesn't make sense. According to this, we never left. It shows us walking in a straight line from the campsite to the campsite, like we just walked in a circle right here on the shore. I looked at the GPS track on my own unit. Same thing. A simple loop, maybe 100 yards in diameter, that started and ended at Marcus's tent. But we'd walked for over an hour. We'd climbed a mountain slope, crossed an alpine basin, passed through a rock gap. Hadn't we? I tried to remember the details of the hike. The forest, the switchbacks, the basin with the wrong peaks. But the memories felt slippery, hard to hold on to, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The more I focused on them, the more they seemed to shift and change. "We need to try the other fork," Vera said. "The one we didn't take." We went back to the place where the trail split. The fork was still there, both paths looking equally legitimate. We took the right-hand trail this time, the one that angled more to the northeast. I tied fresh orange flagging tape to a tree at the split, making note of which direction we were choosing. This trail was different from the first. It descended instead of climbing, following a creek bed down into a narrow valley. Marcus's boot prints were visible here too, clear tracks in the mud along the creek. We followed them for about 30 minutes, the valley getting narrower and darker as the walls closed in on either side. Then the prints just stopped, mid-stride, exactly like I'd heard about in stories from other rangers. One complete footprint, then nothing. The ground beyond was undisturbed, no sign of where Marcus had gone. I examined the area carefully, looking for any indication he'd turned around or climbed the valley walls. Nothing. "Theo," Vera said, her voice tight. "Look up." I looked. About 15 feet above us, on a narrow ledge that jutted out from the valley wall, there was another boot print. A left boot, Marcus's tread pattern, pressed into a thin layer of dirt on the ledge. There was no way to reach that ledge from where the prints ended. No handholds, no rope marks, no disturbed vegetation. It was like Marcus had teleported from the ground to the ledge, then disappeared entirely. We spent the next hour trying to figure out how he could have gotten up there. We found no solution. The ledge was unreachable without technical climbing gear, and Marcus hadn't brought any according to his equipment list. The sun was getting low, shadows lengthening across the valley. We needed to make a decision about whether to camp or retreat to the trailhead. Vera radioed dispatch to update them on our location and what we'd found. The response was garbled, full of static and strange interference that almost sounded like whispering. "Dispatch, repeat," Vera said. "You're breaking up." More static, then a voice that might have been the dispatcher. "Location unclear, GPS showing, multiple positions." The radio went dead. Vera tried again, switching channels, checking the battery. Nothing. Complete silence. "We should head back," I said. "Get back to the truck, report everything in person, come back tomorrow with a full team." Vera nodded, already turning back up the valley. We retraced our route, following the creek back up to where it met the main trail. But when we reached what should have been the fork, there was only one trail. The split was gone. Just a single path, heading in a direction that didn't match either of the two trails we'd seen before. I checked my watch. 6:47 p.m. We'd been searching for almost 10 hours, and we were lost. Not just disoriented or off route. Actually, genuinely lost in mountains I'd been patrolling for 8 years. "We need to mark our route," I said, pulling out the roll of orange flagging tape. "Make sure we can backtrack if we need to." I started tying tape to trees and rocks every 50 yards, making each piece about a foot long so it would be clearly visible. Vera kept careful notes of our heading, elevation changes, terrain features. We moved slowly, deliberately, making sure we wouldn't lose our way. The trail wound through forest that looked familiar but not quite right. Trees in slightly wrong positions, rocks that seemed to have shifted, clearings where there shouldn't be any. The light was fading fast, that rapid mountain twilight where day turns to night in minutes rather than hours. We'd been hiking for maybe 45 minutes when we saw it. A tent set up in a small clearing just off the trail. The same green tent we'd seen at Little Mullis Lake. Marcus's tent, but that was impossible. We'd walked away from the lake, followed a completely different route, marked our trail carefully. We couldn't be back at the same campsite. Could we? I approached the tent carefully. It was identical to Marcus's, same brand, same color, same wear patterns, but when I looked inside it was empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, nothing. Just an empty tent standing in a clearing that shouldn't exist. "Theo," Vera said urgently, "the flagging tape." I turned to look at the trail behind us. The orange tape I'd tied was still there, marking our route clearly. But something was wrong with it. The pieces I'd tied pointing behind us, marking where we'd come from, were now pointing ahead, toward the direction we'd been walking. Not torn loose and blown around. Not moved by animals. The tape was still securely tied to the same trees and rocks, in the same knots I'd made. But it was pointing the wrong direction, like the trail behind us had somehow become the trail ahead of us. "We need to camp," Vera said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's getting dark, we're disoriented. We need to stay put until morning." She was right. Continuing to hike in the dark while confused about our location would be dangerous. We had emergency bivy sacks, water filtration, enough food for a couple days. We could spend the night here, and in the morning, with clear heads and good light, we'd figure out where we were. We set up our bivvies about 50 yards from the empty tent, in a spot with good visibility in all directions. I built a small fire ring, got a fire going for warmth and light. Vera filtered water from a small stream nearby and prepared some freeze-dried meals. As we ate, I kept looking at the empty tent. It just sat there in the darkness beyond our fire's light, a pale shape that didn't belong. I wanted to go tear it down, collapse it, prove it wasn't real. But something stopped me, some instinct that said touching it would be a mistake. We took turns keeping watch through the night. Vera took the first shift while I tried to sleep, though sleep was hard to come by. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's journal entry, "Trail keeps moving," and heard his message carved in stone, "Trail loops back." Around midnight, during my watch shift, I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Footsteps. Someone walking through the forest, boots crunching on fallen pine needles. Coming closer. "Who's there?" I called out. "Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then they started again. Same pace, same rhythm, still approaching. I grabbed my flashlight, shined it toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and darkness, but the footsteps continued, clearly audible, getting closer with each step. They walked right past our camp. I tracked the sound with my flashlight, but there was nothing to see. Just the noise of boots on forest floor, moving at a steady walking pace. They passed within 10 feet of where I sat, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was making them. The footsteps stopped at the empty tent. I heard the sound of a zipper, tent fabric rustling. Then silence. I kept my flashlight trained on the tent, every muscle tense. After a few minutes, I saw movement. A shadow, cast by my flashlight, of someone inside the tent. Someone sitting up, stretching, moving around like they'd just woken up. But when I looked directly at the tent, there was no one there. Just an empty tent, the fabric completely still. The shadow was clear on the ground, showing every detail of a person moving around inside. But the person casting the shadow didn't exist in any visible form. Vera was awake now, sitting up in her bivvy, watching the tent with wide eyes. "Do you see that?" she whispered. "The shadow," I confirmed. "Yeah, I see it." We watched as the shadow person went through the motions of breaking camp, rolling up a sleeping bag, packing gear, organizing a backpack, all in complete silence, all completely invisible except for the shadow cast by my flashlight. Then the shadow stood up, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. It stood there for a moment, as if looking around to orient itself. Then it started walking, right toward us. We scrambled out of our bivvies, backing away from the approaching shadow. It moved steadily, purposefully, the silhouette of a man with a backpack walking at a normal hiking pace. My flashlight was still on, still creating the shadow, but there was nothing solid to cast it. Just empty air moving through the forest. The shadow walked right through the space where we'd been sleeping, passed through our fire without disturbing it, and continued on into the forest beyond. We tracked it with the flashlight until it disappeared into the trees. Then silence. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat by the fire, feeding it constantly, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. The empty tent stood silent across the clearing, its entrance zipped shut again, though neither of us had seen it close. Dawn came as a gradual lightening of the sky, the stars fading one by one. As soon as we had enough light to see clearly, we packed up our gear. I wanted to leave the empty tent alone, but Vera insisted we check it one more time. Inside, we found Marcus's sleeping bag, the same one that had been at his campsite at Little Molus Lake, the one we'd seen in its stuff sack yesterday. But here it was now, laid out as if someone had slept in it, still holding the shape of a body. "This is wrong," Vera said quietly. "This is all wrong." We left the tent and started hiking, following our flagging tape markers, but just like the night before, they were pointing in the wrong direction. The pieces I'd tied to mark where we'd come from were now indicating our forward path. The trail had reversed itself overnight. Or we had. I pulled out my GPS to check our coordinates. The unit showed us at Little Molus Lake, even though we were clearly somewhere else. I showed the screen to Vera. Her unit showed the same thing. According to both our GPS units, we hadn't moved at all since arriving at Marcus's campsite yesterday afternoon. We followed the trail for about 2 hours, the sun climbing higher, burning off the early morning chill. The landscape shifted around us in ways that made my head hurt. We'd see a distinctive rock formation ahead, hike toward it, but when we reached what should have been that location, the formation would be somewhere else, off to our left or right. Landmarks refused to stay in fixed positions. Around 9 a.m. we found another cairn, different from the one we'd seen yesterday, but built in the same style. And next to it, another message carved into stone. 4th time in basin maps are lying going south. HMH. Marcus Hendricks. This was his cairn, his message. And he'd been here 4 times? How long had he been wandering in circles before he'd stopped leaving messages? "We need to find a way out," Vera said, trying to keep her voice steady. We need to get back to the trailhead and call for backup. This is beyond what we can handle. I agreed. We weren't equipped for whatever this was. We needed more people, more resources, maybe even outside experts who specialized in what? Spatial anomalies, reality distortions. I didn't even know what to call what we were experiencing. We decided to follow Marcus's last instruction. Go south. I pulled out my compass, but the needle still spun uselessly. I tried using the sun instead, calculating south based on its position and the time of day. We started walking in what I believed was the right direction. The terrain changed as we hiked. We passed through sections of forest, then open meadow, then boulder fields, the transitions happening too quickly, the distances feeling wrong. A stretch of trail that felt like it took an hour to cover would show on our GPS as a mere 100 yards. Another section that seemed like a 10-minute walk would register as 3 miles. And always, Marcus's boot prints. We'd see them sporadically, sometimes fresh, sometimes old and weathered. At one point we found 3 sets of his prints, all slightly different in how worn they looked, all heading in different directions from the same spot. Like he'd been here multiple times, on different days, choosing different routes each time. Around noon, we stopped to rest and eat. I was studying my map, trying to match the terrain around us to the topographic features, when I noticed something strange. The map had changed. Not dramatically, but subtly. Elevation contours that I'd memorized were slightly different. A creek, I was sure, had been on the east side of a ridge was now marked on the west side. "Vera," I said carefully, "do you remember what your map looked like yesterday?" She pulled out her map, studied it. Her face went pale. "The trail configuration is different. I know I memorized this section, and it's not the same." We compared our maps to each other and to our GPS overlays. None of them agreed. My map showed one trail system, Vera's showed a slightly different configuration, and the GPS showed a third variation, and I was almost certain all 3 had changed from what they'd shown yesterday. "The maps are lying," Vera said quietly, echoing Marcus's carved message. That's what he meant. The maps themselves are changing. It was an impossible thought. Maps don't change. They're representations of fixed physical features. But the evidence was there, literally in our hands. The trails we'd memorized, the features we'd studied for years, they were shifting, rearranging themselves like pieces on a game board. We kept moving south, or what we hoped was south. After another hour of hiking, we topped a small rise and saw something that stopped us cold. A campsite, with a familiar green tent. But this time, there was someone there. A man sat on a rock near the tent, his back to us. His posture slumped with exhaustion. He wore the same clothing described in Marcus's missing person report. Blue jacket, gray pants, green hat. It had to be him. "Marcus," I called out. "Marcus Hendricks." The figure didn't respond, didn't turn around, just sat there, unmoving. We approached cautiously. As we got closer, I could see more details. The jacket was torn, the backpack beside him scratched and damaged. His hands hung limp at his sides. "Marcus?" Vera said softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, the figure collapsed, just crumpled like it was made of paper, folding in on itself until all that remained was a pile of empty clothing. No body, no bones, nothing but the clothes he'd been wearing, arranged in roughly human shape. Vera jumped back with a strangled cry. I stood there staring at the pile of clothes, my mind refusing to process what I'd just seen. People don't collapse into empty clothing. That's not how physics works. That's not how anything works. But it had happened. We'd both seen it. I forced myself to check the clothes more carefully. They were real, solid, definitely the items Marcus had been wearing. His ID was in the jacket pocket, confirming this was his gear. But the man himself was gone, if he'd ever really been there at all. "We're seeing things," Vera said, her voice shaking. "We're hallucinating. Altitude sickness maybe, or dehydration, or we're both seeing the same things," I interrupted. "That's not how hallucinations work." She knew I was right. Whatever was happening to us, it was external, not internal. The mountains were doing something to reality itself, bending it, distorting it, making the impossible manifest. We continued searching the area around the campsite. Behind the tent, we found a makeshift calendar scratched into a flat stone. Tally marks, organized in groups of 5, then 7-day weeks marked off. I counted them. 43 days. Marcus had been out here for 43 days, even though he'd only been missing for 7. He'd been trapped in some kind of time dilation, where days passed differently than they should. Or he'd been here multiple times, each visit lasting longer than the last. "Look at this," Vera said. She was holding Marcus's journal, the same one we'd found at Little Mollis Lake. But this was a different copy, or a version from later in his journey. The entries continued beyond the "trail keeps moving" message. Day 8, tried going west. Ended up back at original camp. Trail is non-linear. Day 12, found my own campsite from 3 days ago, but I never camped there. Different version of me. Day 19, saw myself on ridge. Called out. Other me didn't respond. Walked into shimmer and disappeared. Day 27, understanding now. Multiple paths, multiple times, all overlapping, need to find the divergence point. Day 34, she's here, the woman from the photos. But she's been dead for 20 years. She doesn't know she's dead. Day 43, found the way out. It's not a place, it's a moment, when the trails align. Tonight, midnight. If I fail, I won't write again. There were no entries after day 43 that had been his last attempt to escape, and judging by the pile of empty clothes, he hadn't succeeded. Or he had succeeded, but not in the way he'd hoped. "What did he mean about a divergence point?" Vera asked, flipping through the journal pages. "And who's the woman?" I didn't know, but I was starting to form a theory, as crazy as it sounded. These mountains had thin places, spots where the normal rules broke down, where different versions of reality overlapped, where time didn't flow in a straight line, where cause and effect became negotiable. And somehow Marcus had figured that out. He'd been documenting it, trying to understand the pattern, looking for a way to use it to escape. We needed to do the same. I pulled out my notebook, started documenting everything we'd experienced. The forking trails that looped back on themselves, the flagging tape that reversed direction overnight, the GPS coordinates that claimed we never moved, the maps that changed their features, the shadow person that moved without a body, the collapsing figure made of empty clothes. There was a pattern here. I knew there had to be. Nothing was truly random. Even quantum mechanics had rules. Even chaos theory had attractors. These mountains were operating on some kind of logic, even if it wasn't logic we immediately understood. "The cairns," I said suddenly. Marcus built cairns every time he reached a certain point. That means he kept coming back to the same locations, even when he tried going different directions. "Attractor points," Vera said, catching on. "Specific coordinates that the trails all eventually lead to, regardless of which path you take." We spent the next hour mapping the cairns we'd found, along with the campsites and other landmarks. Using our GPS coordinates, even though we didn't trust them, we plotted everything on a fresh page in my notebook. A pattern emerged. All the cairns, all the campsites, all the strange occurrences, They formed a rough circle about 3 miles in diameter, and at the center of that circle, according to our maps, was an unnamed tarn that didn't appear in any official documentation. "That's where we need to go," I said, pointing to the center of the circle. "That's the divergence point Marcus wrote about." "Or it's where we'll end up trapped like him," Vera countered. "Maybe the center is the worst place to go. Maybe we should be trying to get to the edge, break out of the circle." She had a point, but I remembered Marcus's last entry. It's not a place, it's a moment. The divergence point wasn't spatial, it was temporal. A specific time when the overlapping realities aligned in a way that allowed passage from one to another. "Midnight," I said. "He wrote that he was going to try at midnight. That must be when the boundaries are thinnest, when the trails align properly." We had about 11 hours until midnight. We spent them hiking toward the center of the circle, toward the unnamed tarn. The journey should have taken maybe an hour based on the distance. It took 6. The landscape kept shifting around us. We'd recognize a section of trail, mark it on our maps, then come back to it from a different angle and find it had changed. Rock formations moved. Trees appeared and disappeared. Streams flowed uphill, then downhill, then ceased to exist entirely. At one point, we saw ourselves. Not shadows, not empty clothes, but actual physical versions of Vera and me, hiking about 100 yards away. We called out to them, tried to catch up. They didn't respond, just kept walking at the same steady pace, until they stepped behind a boulder and vanished. Around 8 p.m., as the sun was setting, we finally reached the tarn. It was small, maybe 50 feet across, the water perfectly still and black as obsidian. The shore was ringed with standing stones, natural rock formations that looked almost like they'd been deliberately placed. And in the center of the tarn, rising about 2 feet above the water's surface, was a single flat stone like an altar. Carved into every standing stone around the shore was the same symbol, a circle with 7 radiating lines like a simple sun. I'd never seen it before, didn't recognize it from any native petroglyphs or historical markings, but it was clearly intentional, clearly meant to mark this place as significant. "This is it," Vera said quietly. "The divergence point." We set up camp on the shore, built a fire for warmth and light as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Then we waited. As midnight approached, the air around the tarn changed. It grew thick, heavy, like the atmosphere itself was condensing. The fire burned with a strange blue tinge, and sounds became muffled and distant. The stars overhead seemed to rotate slowly, creating spiral patterns that made me dizzy if I looked at them too long. At 11:47 p.m., by my watch we saw the first one emerge. A hiker walked out of the forest and approached the tarn. He moved stiffly, mechanically, his face blank and expressionless. He walked straight to the water's edge, stood there for a moment, then stepped onto the surface. He didn't sink. The water held his weight like it was solid ground. He walked toward the center stone, each step leaving ripples that spread in perfect geometric patterns. When he reached the center, he sat down and became perfectly still. "Should we stop him?" Vera whispered. I shook my head. Something told me we were witnessing something we shouldn't interfere with. This was part of the pattern, part of how this place worked. More hikers emerged from the forest. Men and women of different ages, all wearing backpacking gear from different eras. Some had modern equipment, others carried wooden frame packs and wore clothing from decades past. They all moved in that same mechanical way. All walked onto the water without sinking. All headed for the center stone. Within 10 minutes, there were maybe 20 people sitting on the center stone, all perfectly still, all staring at nothing. And I recognized some of them. A woman in 1970s gear that I'd seen in missing person reports. A man whose face matched a photo from a 1989 case. And there, sitting near the edge of the stone, was Marcus Hendricks. He looked different from the collapsing figure we'd seen earlier. More solid, more present. But still wrong, still too still, still moving with that mechanical quality that suggested these weren't quite people anymore. Or they were people who'd become something else. At precisely midnight, the tarn's surface began to glow. A faint, blue luminescence that grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with a sound I felt more than heard. The figures on the center stone stood up in unison, turned to face different directions, and began to speak. They all spoke at once, but each was saying something different. Coordinates, directions, warnings, descriptions of trails and landmarks. It was overwhelming, a cacophony of voices all layering over each other. But gradually, I started to pick out individual phrases. Trail forks at the dead pine. Cairn marks the third loop. Water flows backward past the ridge. Midnight alignment opens western path. They were describing routes. Paths through this distorted landscape. Trails that only existed at certain times. Ways to navigate the overlapping realities. This was how the pattern worked. The lost hikers became guides, their knowledge incorporated into the system, used to help others find their way, or trap them further. I started writing frantically, trying to capture as much of the information as possible. Vera did the same, both of us scribbling notes as fast as we could write. The voices continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped all at once. The figures on the center stone turned back to face the same direction, north, and began walking. They stepped off the stone onto the water, walked across its glowing surface to the northern shore, and disappeared into the forest one by one. Marcus was the last to leave. He paused at the shore, turned to look directly at us, and for just a moment his face showed recognition. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then he turned and walked into the darkness. The glow faded from the tarn. The thick quality left the air. Everything returned to normal, or as normal as anything had been since we'd started this search. "Did you get it?" Vera asked urgently, holding up her notebook. "Did you write down the instructions?" I compared my notes to hers. We'd both captured different fragments, but together we had something coherent. A route that supposedly led out of the circle, but only if we followed it at specific times, making specific turns based on the position of landmarks that might or might not still be there. "Do we trust it?" Vera asked. "Those hikers, they're trapped here. What if this is how the mountains trap more people? Give them false directions, keep them walking in circles until they become part of the pattern." It was a valid concern, but what choice did we have? We'd been trying to find our way out for almost 2 days, and all we'd done was walk in circles. At least this gave us something to try, a route that supposedly worked. We decided to start immediately. According to the instructions, the route opened at midnight and closed at dawn. We had maybe 6 hours to navigate it correctly. The first landmark was the dead pine struck by lightning. We found it about a 1/4 mile from the tarn, a massive ponderosa that had been split down the middle by a lightning strike sometime in the past. According to our notes, we needed to pass it on the left side, not the right, and count exactly 50 paces before turning. We did exactly that. 50 paces, then a 90-degree turn to the east. The trail we followed looked no different from any other trail, but there was something about it that felt right. Like we were finally moving in a direction that matched our intention. The next landmark was the boulder split by ice. We found it where the note said it would be, a huge granite rock that had been cleaved in two by water freezing in a crack. We were supposed to walk between the two halves, not around them. As we squeezed through the narrow gap, I felt something shift. A subtle change in air pressure, a brief moment of disorientation. When we emerged on the other side, the forest looked slightly different. The trees were spaced differently, the undergrowth thicker. We'd crossed some kind of boundary. We continued following the instructions, hitting each landmark in sequence. The stream that flows uphill. We found it, water defying gravity for about 30 yards before leveling out. The cairn of black stones, there exactly where the notes indicated. The meadow with no grass, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by alpine flowers. Each landmark brought another subtle shift, another transition between overlapping versions of the landscape. I started to understand how this place worked. It wasn't one mountain range, it was multiple versions of the same mountain range, all existing simultaneously, all slightly out of phase with each other. The trails were the seams between versions, and if you knew the right route, you could walk from one to another. Around 4 a.m., we reached the final landmark, the tree that grows sideways. We found it growing out of a cliff face, its trunk parallel to the ground for about 15 feet before curving upward. According to the notes, we needed to climb onto the trunk and walk to the end, then step off into empty air. "That's insane," Vera said, looking at the drop below the tree. "That's got to be 100-foot fall." But the notes were clear. Walk to the end of the sideways trunk and step off. Trust the transition. I went first. I climbed onto the trunk, got my balance, and started walking along its length. It was wider than it looked, stable and solid. When I reached the end, I could see nothing below but darkness and rocks. Certain death if this didn't work. I closed my eyes, remembered Marcus's journal entry. "It's not a place, it's a moment," and stepped off. I fell for maybe half a second. Then my feet hit solid ground, and I stumbled forward onto a dirt trail. A normal trail in a normal forest, with the pre-dawn light filtering through the trees in a perfectly ordinary way. I turned around. The sideways tree was gone. I was standing on a regular trail that looked like it hadn't seen anything strange in centuries. "Vera!" I called out. "It worked! Jump!" A moment later, she appeared, stumbling forward just like I had, her eyes wide with shock. We were through. We'd navigated the maze, followed the pattern, and escaped the overlapping realities. We checked our GPS units. They showed us at Molas Pass, about a half-mile from the trailhead where we'd started. We'd walked for almost 2 days, covered what felt like dozens of miles, but we were less than a mile from where we'd begun. We reached the parking lot just as the sun was rising. Marcus's truck was still there, and now our ranger vehicle was parked beside it, exactly where we'd left it 2 days ago. Everything looked normal, mundane, blessedly ordinary. We drove back to the station in silence. What could we say? How could we report what we'd experienced? Missing hiker becomes empty clothes. Maps that change overnight. Flagging tape that reverses direction. Hikers walking on water at midnight. We filed our reports the way Tom had taught me. The truth mostly, with the crazy parts left out. We'd found Marcus's campsite. We'd searched the surrounding area. The terrain was confusing. Our equipment malfunctioned. We'd spent 2 days lost before finding our way back. Marcus Hendricks remained missing, presumed dead due to environmental exposure. The official search continued for another week. Teams covered the area thoroughly, found Marcus's tent and gear, but no sign of the man himself. The case was eventually closed as an unsolved disappearance. But I kept the notes from the midnight gathering, the routes and landmarks described by those lost hikers, the map of a landscape that existed in the spaces between normal reality. And I started noticing something troubling. Other hikers were reporting strange experiences in that area, trails that seemed to move, compass failures, missing time. People finding their own campsites from days they didn't remember. The number of incidents was increasing, the affected area expanding. I began documenting everything, collecting reports from other rangers, interviewing hikers who'd had strange experiences. The pattern was clear. The overlapping realities weren't stable. They were spreading, growing, affecting more of the San Juan Mountains every month. 3 months after Marcus disappeared, Vera turned in her resignation. She said she couldn't work these mountains anymore, couldn't trust the trails or the maps. She transferred to a park in Kansas, somewhere completely flat where the landscape stayed put and the rules remained consistent. I understood. I'd thought about leaving too. But someone needed to stay who knew the truth, who understood how to navigate the thin places when others got lost. I started carrying the midnight notes on every patrol, the routes that only existed at certain times, the landmarks that marked transitions between realities, and twice more I used them to bring people back. Hikers who'd wandered into the overlapping spaces and gotten lost in the loops and recursions. Both times, they reported the same things: trails that changed, maps that lied, themselves walking on water at midnight, speaking coordinates they didn't understand. The pattern was growing stronger, pulling more people in, and I realized something that Marcus had probably figured out toward the end. The lost hikers weren't victims of the pattern. They were part of it, components in a system that used their knowledge and experiences to map itself, to understand itself. Every person who got lost added to the pattern, contributed new routes and landmarks, expanded the network of overlapping paths. The system was learning, evolving, becoming more complex with each person it absorbed. Last month, I went back to the unnamed tarn, waited until midnight. The ritual played out exactly as before, hikers emerging from the forest walking on water, sitting on the center stone. But there were more of them now, maybe 40 or 50, including several I recognized from recent missing person cases. And there, sitting near the back, was Vera. She'd resigned, moved to Kansas, gotten as far from these mountains as she could. But she was here now, sitting on the stone with that mechanical posture, staring at nothing with blank eyes. When midnight struck and the voices began, I heard hers among them. The sideways tree is the 7th exit. Follow the blue fire to the western shore. Count the standing stones. Multiply by 3. She'd become part of the pattern. Somehow, despite being hundreds of miles away, the system had claimed her. Because she'd been here, she'd learned the routes. She'd become connected to the network. And the network didn't let go. I don't hike alone anymore, can't risk it. Every time I'm out on patrol, I feel the pull, the invitation to step off the normal trails and into the spaces between. The landmarks call to me. The routes whisper in my mind. The pattern wants me to become part of it. It's only a matter of time, I know that. The more I use the midnight notes to rescue people, the more I learn the routes and landmarks, the more deeply I connect myself to the system. Eventually, I'll go out on a patrol and won't come back. I'll walk onto water at midnight, sit on the center stone, and become another voice describing coordinates in the darkness. But until then, I keep working, keep documenting, keep trying to understand how this pattern works and why it's growing. Maybe somewhere in all the data I'm collecting, there's an answer. A way to stop the spread, to free the trapped hikers, to restore normal causality to these mountains. Or maybe there's no stopping it. Maybe this is just what happens to mountains that are old enough, remote enough, strange enough. They develop their own logic, their own rules, their own appetite for the people who wander into them. I still use maps, but I don't trust them. I check them every morning to see what's changed overnight. Trails appear and disappear. Landmarks shift positions. Entire valleys rearrange themselves. The maps are lying, just like Marcus wrote. Not because they're wrong when they're made, but because the terrain they're describing won't stay still. Last week, I found my own boot prints on a trail I've never hiked. Fresh prints, made recently, with the distinctive wear pattern from my boots. I followed them for about a mile before they ended at a cairn I didn't remember building. Next to the cairn was a message carved in stone, in handwriting that looked exactly like mine. Fifth time here pattern is conscious. It knows your name. I don't remember carving that message. I don't remember being at that location before, but the evidence suggests I was, or will be, or am in some version of reality that doesn't quite sync with my linear experience of time. The pattern is conscious. It knows my name. And sooner or later, it's going to call me home. I've started leaving my own notes for whoever comes after me. Instructions on how to navigate the thin places, warnings about the midnight gatherings, descriptions of the routes that lead in and out of the overlapping realities. Maybe they'll help the next ranger who has to search these mountains for missing hikers. Or maybe they'll just become more data for the pattern to absorb, more information for the system to use in mapping itself. Either way, someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand that the San Juan Mountains aren't what they appear to be. That trails can move, maps can lie, and if you're not careful, you can walk in circles forever while time passes differently for you than for everyone else. The mountains are patient. They've been here for millions of years, and they'll be here millions more. They have all the time in the world to wait for you to take one wrong turn. Follow one path that branches in impossible directions. Step into one of the thin places where the overlapping realities meet. And once you're in, once you've learned the routes and landmarks, once you've sat on the center stone and spoken coordinates at midnight, you're part of the pattern forever. The maps will change to include you. The trails will shift to accommodate your wanderings. And somewhere, in a version of these mountains that exists slightly to the left of normal reality, you'll keep walking, keep searching, keep trying to find your way home. But home is a fixed point, and you're not fixed anymore. You're fluid, quantum, existing in multiple states simultaneously. You're both lost and found, both alive and gone, both trapped and free. You're part of the mountains now, part of the pattern, and the pattern is always growing. Yesterday morning, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. I was doing a routine patrol near Engineer Mountain, checking trail conditions after a recent storm, when I noticed something odd about the trail markers. They were official Park Service markers, the kind we install to guide hikers, but they were positioned wrong. Not just slightly off, but fundamentally incorrect, pointing hikers toward terrain that didn't match the indicated routes. I started documenting the discrepancies with my camera, photographing each misplaced marker, when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The markers weren't misplaced. The trails had moved around them. The markers were still exactly where we'd installed them years ago, but the trails themselves had shifted, rerouted, reorganized themselves into new configurations. I pulled out 3 different maps, my personal topographic chart from 5 years ago, an official Park Service map from last year, and a brand new map I'd picked up at the station that morning. I spread them out on a flat boulder and compared them side by side. They were all different. Not subtly different, but dramatically different. Entire trail systems had rearranged themselves. A loop that used to be 7 miles was now marked as 12 on one map and 4 on another. A junction that all 3 maps agreed existed showed completely different trails branching from it. It was like looking at 3 maps of 3 different mountain ranges that just happened to share the same peak names. I took photos of all 3 maps, documented the locations where they disagreed, and started hiking what should have been a familiar trail back to my truck. But within 20 minutes I was completely disoriented. The trail forked in places it had never forked before. Landmarks I'd memorized were in wrong positions. A distinctive rock formation I'd been using as a reference point for years was suddenly on my left when it should have been on my right. My GPS was useless, showing my position jumping erratically across the map, sometimes placing me miles from where I physically stood. My compass spun continuously, the needle unable to settle. I was lost in mountains I'd been patrolling for 8 years, less than 3 miles from a trailhead I could navigate to blindfolded on a normal day. I forced myself to stop, to think rationally. I'd escaped the pattern once before by following the midnight instructions. I still had those notes, had them memorized actually from the hours I'd spent studying them, but those routes only worked at specific times, and it was early afternoon. I needed a different approach. That's when I remembered something Marcus had written in his later journal entries. Something about understanding the pattern's logic, about learning to see the transitions between overlapping realities. He'd mentioned that the boundaries became visible if you knew what to look for. Subtle shimmer in the air, slight distortions in how light bent around certain areas. I started looking for those signs, scanning the forest for any indication of where one reality ended and another began. And I found them, dozens of them. Vertical seams in the air where the atmosphere looked slightly wrong. Places where tree trunks seemed to blur at specific heights. Spots where the ground looked solid, but my depth perception insisted it was at a different distance than my eyes suggested. The boundaries were everywhere, and they were active, shifting positions every few minutes, opening and closing like breathing pores in the fabric of space. I was standing in a zone where multiple versions of the mountain were overlapping heavily, where the barriers between realities had worn so thin they were practically transparent. I marked the nearest boundary with a piece of flagging tape, then stepped back and watched it. Over the course of 10 minutes, I observed it shift position by about 3 feet, moving in a slow oscillation like a pendulum. It wasn't random, it was following a pattern, a rhythm I could track and predict. I spent the next hour mapping the boundaries I could see, noting their positions and movement patterns. A picture emerged. The boundaries all seemed to be anchored to specific geographic features, large boulders, old trees, distinctive rock formations, and they all pulsed in synchronization, expanding and contracting in a coordinated rhythm. It was like the overlapping realities were breathing, just like the mountains themselves had always been said to breathe. The boundaries expanded during the exhale, contracted during the inhale. And at the peak of each breath cycle, there was a brief moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, where the boundaries stabilized, where you could see clearly which side was which. I waited for that moment, watched the boundaries pulse and shift, and when they stabilized during an exhale peak, I stepped through. The transition was immediate and disorienting. One moment, I was in dense forest with afternoon light filtering through the canopy. The next, I was in the same forest but with slightly different tree spacing, slightly different undergrowth, and light that suggested a different time of day, either earlier or later, I couldn't tell which. I checked my GPS. Still useless, still jumping around the map, but something about the forest felt more stable, more normal. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking. Over the next 3 hours, I crossed maybe a dozen more boundaries, each time waiting for the stabilization moment, each time stepping through into a slightly different version of the mountains. And gradually, the transitions became easier to spot, easier to navigate. I was learning the pattern's rhythm, understanding its logic. Finally, as the sun was setting, I crossed one more boundary and found myself on a trail I recognized with absolute certainty. Not because it looked familiar, but because it felt right. The trees were exactly where they should be. The rocks properly positioned. The light falling at correct angles. This was baseline reality, the version of the mountains that stayed consistent, that matched the maps we drew and the GPS coordinates we recorded. I practically ran down that trail, desperate to get back to my truck before another transition could catch me. I made it to the parking lot just as full darkness fell, my hands shaking as I unlocked the vehicle. I drove straight to the station, found my supervisor Tom in his office, and told him everything. I didn't leave out the crazy parts this time. I showed him the photos of the 3 different maps, the images of boundaries in the air, the documentation of trails that had moved. I told him about Vera appearing at the midnight gathering despite being hundreds of miles away, about Marcus's empty clothes, about the pattern that was growing and learning and consuming more of these mountains every day. He listened without interrupting, his face grave. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick file folder, similar to the one he'd shown me years ago about the thin places. "It's accelerating," he said quietly. "We've had 12 incidents in the past month alone. Hikers reporting impossible terrain, rangers getting lost in familiar areas, entire trail systems rearranging overnight. The higher-ups want to close parts of the wilderness area, claim it's for trail maintenance or wildlife protection. But we both know the real reason." He spread out a map on his desk. It was covered in markings, red circles indicating zones where reality was unstable, yellow highlights showing trails that had moved, blue dots marking locations where hikers had disappeared. The affected area had grown enormously since I'd first started tracking it. What had been isolated incidents around a few peaks had spread across dozens of square miles. "We're losing the mountains," Tom said. "Not to fire or development or climate change. We're losing them to something else, something that's been here all along but stayed quiet until recently. And I don't know how to stop it." He looked at me with tired eyes. "You've been deeper into it than anyone else who's come back. You understand the pattern better than any of us. So I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Is there a way to reverse this? A way to stabilize the boundaries and restore normal causality?" I thought about everything I'd learned. The midnight gatherings where lost hikers spoke coordinates. The routes that only existed at certain times. The boundaries that breathed in synchronized rhythms. The way the pattern absorbed knowledge from every person it claimed. "I don't think it wants to be reversed," I said, finally. "I think it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. These mountains have always been here, always been strange. Maybe the stable reality we think of as normal is actually the anomaly. Maybe the overlapping versions, the shifting trails, the flexible geography. Maybe that's what these mountains really are, and we've just been seeing a simplified version all this time." Tom nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then what do we do? How do we keep people safe in mountains that won't stay still?" I didn't have a good answer. We couldn't close the entire wilderness area. It was too large, too important. We couldn't tell people the truth. Who would believe it? And we couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when rangers were getting lost and hikers were walking into zones they'd never walk out of. "We teach people to see the boundaries," I said. "We can't stop the pattern, but we can learn to navigate it. Train rangers to recognize the signs, develop protocols for crossing safely, create maps that account for the multiple overlapping versions instead of pretending there's only one static reality." "That's insane," Tom said. But he didn't say it was wrong. We spent the rest of that night developing preliminary protocols. How to identify boundary zones, how to wait for stabilization moments, how to recognize which version of reality you're in based on subtle environmental cues. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Since then, I've been training other rangers. Not officially. The Park Service would never approve such a program, but quietly, one-on-one, teaching the ones who've seen enough to know the truth. We're building a knowledge base, a collective understanding of how to work in mountains that have stopped pretending to be stable. And we're seeing results. Fewer rangers getting lost. More successful rescues of hikers who wander into the wrong zones. A growing database of boundary locations and movement patterns that helps us predict where the danger spots are on any given day. But it's a temporary solution at best. The pattern is still growing, still spreading, still claiming more territory. Last week, we had reports of reality instability as far east as Wolf Creek Pass, over 40 miles from where it started. The overlapping versions are bleeding outward, affecting more of the San Juans every month. I keep wondering if this is happening in other mountain ranges too. If rangers in the Sierras or the Cascades or the Rockies are experiencing similar phenomena but not reporting it because it sounds too crazy. If mountains all over the world are slowly revealing their true nature as places where reality is negotiable, where geography is fluid, where the rules we thought were universal turn out to be local suggestions. I also wonder about Marcus sometimes, about Vera, about all the others who sit on the center stone at midnight and speak coordinates into the darkness. Are they conscious in there? Do they know what they've become? Or is it like a dream, a confused state where they think they're still searching for a way out, not realizing they've already become part of the infrastructure that traps others? I hope they're not conscious. I hope it's peaceful in whatever way that's possible, because the alternative, being aware, being trapped, being used as a component in an expanding pattern you can't escape, that's worse than death. Sometimes I dream that I'm already there, that I'm sitting on the stone with the others, speaking routes and coordinates, my voice joining the chorus that guides hikers deeper into the maze. And when I wake up, I have to check my maps, verify my location, confirm that I'm still in the baseline reality and not one of the overlapping versions. So far, I've always been where I should be. But I know it's temporary. The pattern knows my name. It's been patient, letting me play my role as teacher and rescuer, but eventually it will call me home. And when it does, I hope the rangers I've trained will remember what I taught them. Hope they'll use the protocols we developed. Hope they'll keep mapping the boundaries and teaching others and adapting to mountains that refuse to stay still. Because the San Juans aren't done changing. They're just getting started. And all we can do is learn to change with them or be left behind in a version of reality that no longer exists.